Iron Hand, written and read by Charlie Fletcher. The story so far. On a school trip, George breaks a carving of a dragon on the front of the Natural History Museum. This wakes an ancient force imprisoned in the stone, and a vengeful carving of a pterodactyl peels off the side of the building and begins chasing him. But a statue of a World War I soldier, the gunner, steps off a war memorial and saves him. So begins George's ordeal, trapped in a lair of London in which two hostile tribes of statues, the human-based Spits and the inhuman Taints, live in an uneasy truce. The only person who can see what is happening to him is Edie Lemmel, who's a glint. Glints are females who can touch stones and experience past events imprinted in them. Nobody's ever explained Edie's gift to her, so she sees it as a curse and thinks she's mad. She is also on the run. George, Edie and the gunner set off on a journey to make amends, but the walker, a servant of the stone, stalks them through the streets with the help of his own servant, the raven. On this journey, George discovers he has special powers that make him a target for the enraged Taints. One of the dragon statues that guards the city of London slashes a scar onto his hand that another statue, the smiling but sinister Black Friar, tells them is a maker's mark. It identifies George as a maker, someone with a special gift for sculpting things from stone or metal. The friar also tells them to find the stone heart and put the broken dragon carving back to make amends for the damage George has done. Helped by benign Spits and threatened by violent Taints, they eventually find themselves at the stone heart of London, the London Stone. But on the way, the gunner, trying to save Edie, falls into the clutches of the walker. It is left to George to use his newfound gifts as a maker to rescue her. And now, the story continues. The walker and the gunner fell into a deep abyssal blackness beyond even the memory of light. Though the gunner sensed they were plummeting through a succession of layers, as black flashed black in an unpleasant negative strobing that he felt rather than saw, and then, abruptly, the gunner's knees crunched down into wet gravel, and his free hand instinctively palmed out to halt his fall, sending a jarring shock up his arm as it smacked into an unseen stone wall in front of him. He hung there, head low, angled between the wall and the ground, panting for breath. Feeling more wrong than he'd ever felt, he heard the burl of gravel beside him as the walker moved his feet. And then the lights came on. The first thing he saw was the upturned bowl of his tin helmet lying on the stones in front of his thick hobnailed army boots. Then he saw the protective legging cinched onto his right calf with 3 buckled straps. On a real soldier, the legging would have been leather, but since he was a statue, it was made from bronze, like the rest of him. His left calf was tightly wound with bandage-like puttees. He scooped up the helmet, put it on, and stood up straight, every inch the battle-worn World War I veteran that he'd been sculpted to be. And then, despite his best intentions, his jaw dropped in shock. They were in a large underground water tank. His feet stood on a small shelf of pea gravel that sloped against one wall. This tiny beach took a bite out of a rough square of black water, about 10 meters on each side. The irregular blocks of stone lining the walls of the tank were mottled with age and fungus. Drips from the stone roof plopped concentric circles onto the dark surface. But what made the gunner gasp in surprise was the lights. Each wall had an outline of light blazing from it, a shape about the height of a man and perhaps a third as wide, made from pieces of broken glass. The shapes all had the same distinctive outline of a squat turret, and the light blasting forth from each of the 4 tower shapes intersected at the centre of the water tank. Here, a silver disc spun lazily at the end of a piece of chain, reflecting the light randomly round the room. "What is this?" asked the gunner. He heard a sniff of contempt from the gaunt figure up to its knees in the water at the edge of the gravel bar. The walker wore a long green tweed overcoat with a hooded sweatshirt underneath it. He swept the hood back and ran his fingers through long rat-tailed hair brindled with grey. He had a skull cap on the back of his head and a jutting goatee framing a mouth twisted in a permanent half-open sneer. He held 2 small circular mirrors which he clipped together and stowed in his coat pocket. Then he bent and, lifting a long dagger from the edge of the beach, gestured round the water tank with its gleaming blade. "This is a dream of 4 castles, a vision that came to me long ago when I was a free man. It is a vision I have made real. It is nothing that you could begin to understand." He shifted the blade in his hand and sliced angled reflections of light round the room, revealing more of the edges of the subterranean tank. Darkness was all it contained until I came across it. Now it is a place of power. My power. The gunner felt as if he'd been spirited into the bowels of the earth and pinned beneath a mountain, but he was damned if he was going to let the walker enjoy his discomfort. Where are we? Where is this? The walker spun slowly in full circle, sending the reflected beams of light around the dank edges of the chamber. We are under London, a city you will only ever see again in your memories, for this is where you stay. Forever, perhaps. It goes too. The walker looked at the gunner with something like pleasure. You feel it, don't you? Inside. The emptiness, the rising horror, the loss of strength, the sense that you're not master of yourself. The gunner made himself stand straight. Don't worry about me, chum. I'm right as a trivet. Oh, I'm afraid you're not. You broke an oath sworn to me by the Maker. You have to do what I say. And I order you not to try and dig up towards the light. I require you to die. Midnight will come, your plinth will be empty, and whatever animates you dies. You will be just so much scrap for the smelter. The walker's eyes burned bright with banked-up malice. The gunner stumbled back against the wall, horrified by how weak he'd become, and as he reached back to stop himself falling, he dislodged one of the bright pieces of glass. It fell at his feet, and as he stared at it, his memory fired on reflex, and he saw a similar piece of tumbled glass in Edie's hand. He bent and picked up the sea glass between thumb and forefinger. These heartstones. He heard a dry, humorless chuckle, and looked up into the sour slash of the walker's smile. What have you done, Walker? The gaunt figure above him just kept smiling, like a wolf airing its teeth. The glints, Walker. What the hell have you been doing to them? Edie and George hurried away from Cannon Street, happy to leave the London stone behind them. They were both shocked and footsore, and because both kept their eyes on the hard road in front of them, neither noticed the leaden cloudscape darkening the sky above, or indeed anything that was happening overhead. Which was a shame, because what was above was definitely noticing them. The stone gargoyle on the roof didn't have to look up to see the storm clouds. It felt the rain, even before it started to fall, as a kind of itchy premonition, right in the middle of its back, high between the spiked shoulder blades. Feeling rain coming was part of who it was, for when rain came it had a job to do, spouting water on the roof of St. Pancras Station, a mile or so to the north. But this was not that roof. On this roof it was hiding and watching. It bared its savagely curved fangs and stretched its head over the guttering to scan the street beneath. As the boy and girl hurried along the pavement below, it stalked the parapet, bat-like wings folded behind it, ready to pounce. At first glance, George and Edie looked like any tired kids after a day at school. But at a second look, the marks of a different story were clear. George seemed about 13. His hair was unkempt, his school blazer torn at the shoulder and all scuffed up, as if he'd been rolling on a very dirty floor. His knee flashed white through a tear in his dark trousers, and a smudge of dirt was smeared along the upper curve of his left cheekbone. The dishevelled look was, however, at odds with the steady and determined set to his eyes. Edie was walking with her head bent. A long swathe of aubergine dark hair kept her eyes in shadow, but in the glimpses of them that George was occasionally getting, he could see that they were troubled. Her normally pale skin seemed even whiter, as if all the blood had drained from it, the skin stretched taut with exhaustion. She tripped on a curb, and only his hand whipping out to catch her stopped her hitting the ground. He saw himself swimming into focus in her eyes as she returned from wherever she'd been in her head. "George," she said, "you ever feel like you once done something so bad that bad stuff happens to you because of it?" George rolled his eyes. "What, like break a statue by mistake and end up being chased through London for a day and a half by gargoyles and minotaurs and all that? Yes." She shook her head. "No, I mean before that. Like something that made you break the statue in the first place, something that screwed up your luck forever, that sort of thing." He had a brutal flash of memory. He was shouting something vile at his dad, shouting so loud that snot and tears were flying from his face. He saw the answering tears start in his father's eyes. He saw the door he'd slammed on his father. And he saw that same door opening later that night, revealing the policeman who'd come to tell his mother that there'd been a car accident, that his father would never walk back through that door, any door, ever again. He shook his head. "Edie, we don't have time for this. We need to come up with a plan. We have to rescue the gunner. If we don't find him and get him back on his plinth by midnight—" "I know. He's a dead statue. He'll never move again. I want him back as much as you, George. And it's not just because he saved us and we owe him. The gunner made me feel safe. Me too. The first few fat drops of rain flecked the pavement, and in no time rain was falling so hard that it bounced back upwards off the slick paving stones beneath them. George stepped under the cover of a cafe front, pulling Edie in after him. 7 floors above them, the gargoyle on the roof snarled in frustration and leant out, but all he could see was Edie's feet protruding from beneath the pigeon-splattered plastic canopy. As they stood there, watching the deluge, George tried to come up with a plan, but his mind kept returning to Edie's question about whether he felt cursed. He took a deep breath. The only way to rid himself of her question was going to be to answer it honestly. He realized it was probably going to be hard to say. Before I messed it all up between my dad and me, I said stuff. Everybody says stuff, said Edie. He took a deep breath. Yeah, but not everybody has their dad die before they get a chance to say they didn't mean it. He was surprised. Saying it wasn't as hard as he'd feared. So you said something nasty? That's nothing. It's peanuts. He hated her tone. When you expose a private part of yourself, you really don't want people to snort in derision. He pulled his dignity back round himself, like a protective cloak. Oh, I suppose you've got a deeper, darker secret, right? Yeah. There was no way he was going to give her the satisfaction of asking what it was. She always had to have the last word. There was no way he was going to ask. She looked at him with eyes as shiny and tough as the rain-slicked street behind her. It wasn't just words with me and my dad. And George suddenly knew she was telling him about why she felt cursed. And although he also knew the answer was going to be bad, he knew she needed to say it. So he asked, "And what does that mean?" And she said, "I killed him." Something was wrong. The raven felt it in its bones and feathers as it overflew the green space of Regent's Park. The wrong feeling was that it didn't know where the walker was. Most of the time the walker's presence exerted a magnetic pull on the ancient bird, who'd spent the last 4 centuries or so in his control. Slowing its flight over the sharp-edged hump of the British Museum, it came into hover over the circular sunken area in the front courtyard. It was here the raven felt it had the best chance of finding the walker, but the circle was empty. It needed to find him, and it needed to find the children the walker had sent it to hunt. And because the raven had an infinitely retentive brain, but only 1 pair of eyes, it decided it needed help looking, and with that in mind, it flew south into the tree-crammed space of Tavistock Square. At the centre of the square was a statue of an emaciated man, half-naked and cross-legged, sitting on top of a plinth that had a small arched shrine cut into it. Opposite him, on one of the park benches, sat a tramp in a parka so greasy it looked as if it had been dipped in engine oil. The raven dropped onto the back of the bench on which the tramp sat. Then it hopped onto the tramp's shoulder and gripped hard. The tramp stiffened, but showed no surprise. "What would you be wanting, bird? What would you be wanting with a tallyman?" The bird ducked in closer to the side of his head. The tramp's eyes closed, and his lower lip disappeared under his upper teeth, for all the world like a child concentrating. And what he appeared to be concentrating on was the disjointed clacking of the raven's beak next to his ear. He nodded slowly. "We'll see what we can see." As the tramp opened his eyes and stood up, the raven hopped into the air and hung there watching. The tramp's eyes had changed. Where once they'd been pale and booze-bleached, they were now black. Black eyes, with no whites, as sharp as the eyes of the raven itself, which was, of course, exactly what they'd become. And all over London, under bridges and on park benches, in back alleyways and in hostels that smelt of old soup and new disinfectant, eyes that had been rheumy and bloodshot suddenly changed. Lonely men and women who'd closed normal eyes as they went to sleep in the shelter of vacant shop doors woke up with raven eyes and walked out onto the street, scanning the roadway. The raven had spoken, and all over the city the eyes of the tallyman had opened. Edie was staring at the downpour beyond the awning, face unreadable as she hugged herself against the cold. George was still absorbing what she'd just told him. "You killed your dad?" "Well, he wasn't my real dad. He was a stepdad sort of thing." A stream of water from a broken gutter changed direction in the breeze and splattered them. She pulled her clothes tight around her and ducked into the alleyway beside them. George was still trying to get used to the fact that she had just claimed to be a killer, so a couple of seconds passed before he realized she'd gone and hurried after her into the rain. There was nothing in the alley but a dead end and a parked and dented Japanese car by a builder's skip. "Edie!" he shouted, suddenly panicked. He ran into the narrow space, checking the car as he went, looking for a hidden way out. "It shouldn't have happened," said a small voice from knee level. "I just belted him." He looked down. Edie squatted in the dry area provided by the angled lip of the skip and its overhanging tarpaulin, looking up at him. She shuffled sideways, making a space. He exhaled in relief and ducked in out of the rain next to her. "Don't do that again." She might as well not have heard him, for she carried on with her train of thought. "I just hit him. Didn't know how else to stop him. See, he kept coming after me with a knife. It was on a beach. I just hit him. I didn't mean to kill him. I just hit him." She pulled her legs up to her chin. George waited for her to go on. "He was a boozer. He was drunk all the time. When the pubs were closed, he'd go to the beach hut he had and drink more. That's what my mum said. And then, later, when my mum was taken away and never came back, and it was just him and me, he took me down to the beach. It was the first time I'd seen his hut. It wasn't much. It was one of half a dozen sort of set into the cliff like concrete bunkers. When he unlocked his, I looked through the door. I saw something, and I knew I was in the wrong place." She ground her chin harder into the tops of her knees. "What did you see, Edie?" She shook her head. "Doesn't matter. It wasn't something that was really there anyway. It was something that had been there, once upon a time. And when I touched the wall, I saw it, and I knew I should never, ever go into that hut. And I ran." He thought of her gift for touching stone and metal and experiencing the memories of highly charged past events recorded in them. "You glinted it. You saw the past." "Yeah." She wasn't going to tell him what she'd seen, so instead she looked at George and told him the rest of it. She explained how she'd just run, and when her stepfather had tried to grab her and ask what was wrong, she'd hit him in the middle of his smile and sprinted off along the pebble beach. She told him of how tired she'd got, running on pebbles, and how calmly he'd followed her, climbing over the wooden groins that divided the deserted beach, one after another, the smile on his face wholly at odds with the open knife he held in his hand. She told George how she'd run up a final steep hill of pebbles and found her way blocked by a deep chasm, and then she explained the worst bit, how he'd caught up with her. She didn't tell him what he'd said, or how unnaturally bright his smile had been. She did tell him about the knife, and how she had felt the smooth stone under her hand, and how, when he had lunged, she'd hit him with it. He'd gone down like a tree, tumbling into the chasm, dislodging an avalanche of stones that landslid down in his wake. When things stopped moving, he was more than half hidden by the pebbles. She hadn't known what to do. She'd looked at the heavy stone in her hand, and when she saw something wet glistening on it, she'd tossed it in after him, and then she'd walked back into town and got on a train and come to London. George nodded slowly. "So, it was an accident?" "No," she said. He saw the doors closing in her eyes, locking whatever heavy burden she was carrying back inside. "So, what's the plan?" "Stay alive," said George. "Rescue the gunner." "How?" "No idea. Start by asking for help seems like a good first step." "We can't go to the Sphinxes or dictionary," she said, "because of the city dragons. We're on the wrong side of the boundary, aren't we? And they'll still be guarding it, on the lookout for you." "Well, we could go to the Black Friar." She stared at him. "Are you mad? You said you didn't trust him." "I don't. Not entirely. But he did show us the way to the stone, didn't he? He seemed too eager to get his hands on that broken dragon's head of yours, right?" He felt the now familiar heft of the dragon's head in his pocket. "I think the Black Friar would be open for a deal." "What have we got to deal?" He pulled out the head. "This. He wanted it. Maybe we can give it to him in exchange for help, yeah?" Edie nodded. "What, a Black Friar it is." He saw she was shivering. He took off his jacket and handed it to her. "Put this coat on. Let's get moving. We're not going to save the gunner just sitting here and shivering." After a long beat, she draped the coat over her shoulders. Then she pointed. "George. Your hand." "It's fine." His eyes followed her look. He suddenly felt sick. Something was very wrong. The gunner could feel it like a kind of cold heat, filling the whole underground space. "The Glint's Walker. What the hell have you been doing to them? All these centuries we thought they was dying out as a breed. It wasn't dying out, it was you, picking them off. It was you, wasn't it? How else could you get these heartstones?" The gunner held up the glass in his hand like an accusation. The threadbare shoulders of the walker's coat rose and fell in an irritable shrug. Heartstones, baubles. When a man is doomed to walk the world beyond the natural span of his days, he needs a hobby. Mine has been to collect a few eye-brighteners that give me pleasure. The gunner was outraged. "You've been killing them and stealing their warning stones for a bloody hobby." The walker waved a bored hand at him. "You exaggerate. I don't kill all of them. I may kill some, but it's far from a habit. After all, without their heartstones, they're lost anyway. Their minds unspool." The gunner shook his head. "Why, Walker? Why have you been doing this? Why would the stone want it?" "The stone?" The walker was contemptuous. "The stone wants none of it. This is my doing. The stone has me cursed and enthralled to it, so I must do all its bidding, but not all I do is at its beck and call. I was a great man centuries before you were anything, and I will be a man of power again." Spittle flecked his beard as his voice rose, and the light blazing out from the sea-glass mosaics reflected wildly from his eyes. The gunner twisted his face into a dismissive grin. "Man of power, my Aunt Fanny. Only reason you're still around is you got on the wrong side of the stone. Now you're one of its servants." The walker's eyes blazed angrily back at him. "And what are you? A lump of bronze in man-shape who's broken his word, and is himself now doomed to die alone and in the dark." He waved his hands at the glass shapes on the walls. "When I'm gone, abracadabra, out go the lights." "Wait," said the gunner. "Those kids, don't." "The children, the boy who thwarted me, don't worry about the boy. I shall turn him to my will." "I doubt it. You saw how he chose the hard way. He's got grit. He did it for the girl. He wouldn't leave her in the lurch, and good on him, I say. Leave the kids be, Walker." "Sorry, can't oblige. I have a job for the boy, if he is the maker he seems. Once, many years ago, I had 2 black stone mirrors, darker than the blackness you will be left to die in when I leave." He reached into his pocket, unsnapped 2 small circular silver mirrors from each other, and held one in each hand. "Compared to the black stone mirrors, these little glass mirrors are like a baby's toy. A cheat took one of my black mirrors from me, afraid of the power they'd give when used together. For 2 together can open portals into worlds where there are vast powers, and it is that power I shall harness and free myself. The boy, the unmade maker, will make it for me. The girl, the plucky little glint, will choose the stone that he should shape." He lifted his foot, and gently and impossibly stepped into one of the mirrors he was holding, and then he was gone, and the lights on the walls faded. The last sound the gunner heard was the walker's voice, diminishing and very far off, and it sounded like he was saying, "Whoso list to hunt, I know where there is an hind." And because the gunner knew a hind was another word for a female deer, he knew exactly who the walker was talking about, and he was filled with a surge of unbearably helpless fear for her. Edie stared at George's hand, eyes wide in shock. "What's happening to it?" He had no idea. From the scar that the dragon had slashed on it, 3 distinct lines had begun to emerge, dark veins, colouring the pale skin of his hand as they spiralled down and round his wrist like tendrils on a briar. Each twisting vein was a different colour and texture to the others. All 3 were slightly indented into his skin, like flaws in a rock. "George, we should get you to a casualty or something." He shook his head, fighting the waves of nausea rising inside him. "I don't think this is something a hospital's going to be able to help with." She bent to examine the triple skein of veins more closely. "This one's metal. I think it's bronze or brass." He moved her hand out of the way and made himself trace the mottled bluey-green channel twisting next to it. It was cool to the touch. "This one's not so smooth," he said. "It's like marble." And that left the last pale corded flaw twining down to his wrist. He rubbed it, feeling the rough, shaly texture of limestone. As his thumb traced its course, he could feel a piece of grit detach from the surface and stick to it. "Does it hurt?" asked Edie. He flexed the arm. The veins of bronze and stone seemed to flex with it. He shook his head. "So what are you going to do?" "Not think about it." He stood up. The rain was easing. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, then. Let's go see the friar." She straightened, walked ahead of him out in the dwindling rain shower, and pointed down the road. "Blackfriars is down this way." And because she was ahead of him, She never saw the stone gargoyle take a headfirst leap off the guttering, falling like the half-ton of rock that it was, before its bat-like wings snapped open at the last moment, and it swooped upwards again, one foot talon neatly hitting George between his shoulder blades, while the other closed round his ankle, like a gin trap. So when she turned to see what was taking George so long, she saw nothing. It was as if someone had thrown a switch, and George had simply been turned off, and Edie was alone. There was a pop, and unseen by anyone hurrying through the rain-spattered fastness of Old Change Court, the walker stepped out of his portable mirror. Slotting in behind some young office workers laughing their way to the pub, he followed them across the square. He stopped by a pinch-waisted bronze plinth, on the top of which stood a grotesquely distorted winged figure. From the back he was naked, attached to chopped-off wings by a tortuous harness, his head jammed uncomfortably backwards, his torso bound inside a breastplate device that curved round the front, hiding his face and trapping his arms within. It whimpered as the walker came round to the front, where the only human pieces visible were the legs buckling under the weight of the painful apparatus. "Icarus, I thought you might like to know. Your brother, the Minotaur, is dead. The Minotaur that was sculpted by the same maker who made you." The Icarus screamed, a scream horrifying and raw, though muffled. It was followed by rhythmic, panting sobs as the man or the creature within absorbed the news. "I thought you might like to help me find the people who did it. 2 children. I have a use for them, but if you bring them to me, I will give them to you when I'm done. You have my word." The Icarus hopped grotesquely, awkwardly off the plinth, and landed in a kind of hunched squat, chopped-off wingtips clattering together above his head in furious eagerness. Everybody wants to fly, but nobody wants to fly like George was flying. He was upside down, winded by the sledgehammer blow between his shoulder blades, gagging soundlessly for a breath that just wouldn't come. All he could do was reach a despairing hand back towards the rapidly diminishing figure of Edie as she spun on the crowded pavement, trying to see where he'd gone, looking everywhere but the right way, which was up. Just as his vision started to dim through lack of oxygen, he found a breath and took a deep, whooping lungful of air and yelled, at the very moment the gargoyle crested a building and she was lost to his sight. "Edie!" Above him, he heard the gargoyle hiss in disapproval and felt its grip on his leg tighten. In a couple of thunderous wing flaps, they had cleared the next block of buildings and were flying across the Thames. George glanced up, just in time to see the stone creature taking a quick look down at him. In the microsecond where they were face to face, he recognized the snarling cat head. He gaped in disbelief. Spout? There was no doubt in his mind. This was the gargoyle he'd called Spout, the gargoyle who tried to kill him at the monument that morning, the gargoyle he'd seen shot to smithereens by the gunner. But you're dead. 1 minute he was there, then he was gone. She stepped into the street from the alley, looked right and left, and turned to say she thought they might as well run, and he just wasn't there any more. It was so sudden and shocking that Edie's mind wouldn't let her see the truth of it. Her first reaction was to be annoyed that George was playing games with her, playing hide-and-seek or something. "Come on, George, I'm not in the mood." But he wasn't there. She checked the skip beside the car. There was no mistake. He was gone as cleanly and brutally as if he'd never been there in the first place. Panic swelled up into her chest, making her heart beat faster. And then, just for a treacherous instant, she was sure she heard George calling her name, impossibly far off and desperate, but when she spun in the direction she thought it had come from, there was nothing to see. Beginning to wonder if she was going mad, her foot stumbled over something, and she looked down. A shoe. George's shoe. It was wet and scuffed, but when she put her hand inside it, it was still warm, concrete proof that George had been there, was real, and that she wasn't going mad. She thwacked the heel of the shoe onto the palm of her other hand, insistently beating toughness back into herself. The shoe with its trailing laces reminded her of the gunner's tightly cinched army boots, and thinking of the gunner seemed to help too. She knew instinctively that if he was here now, he'd have dismissed the doubts. She knew exactly what he'd do, and so she did it. Right, enough of that. Job to do. Get going. Hanging upside down, nose to the brickwork of a high chimney, George could feel his heart slamming. Just at the point where he was beginning to see little dancing spots of black unconsciousness whirling in from the edge of his vision, the gargoyle's other leg talon closed round his neck, and he found himself being turned the right way up, and brought face to face with the great feral cat head. The stone mouth worked, trying to get a word out from behind the great teeth. "Why aren't you dead? asked George. Spout looked at him, and though he said nothing, George was shocked to see that he shrugged. By all the rules about spits and taints that George had learnt since he'd fallen into this lair of un-London, where statues walked and talked and flew and fought, Spout should have been dead, back on its perch, never to move again. He'd seen the gunner smithereen it with some of the last bullets from his gun. When taints were damaged like that, they were finished. On the other hand, spits, like the gunner, had a stronger animating spirit holding them together. Even if badly damaged, as long as they could find their way back to their plinth by midnight, the time the gunner had called turn of day, they were revived. With a jolt, George suddenly thought he knew what Spout wanted. He wanted the same as the walker, the broken dragon's head in his pocket. Now he had something to exchange for his life. "Look, I know what you want," he cried. "Here, I've got it." Oh, no. His scrabbling hand found nothing where his coat pocket should be. Now he remembered. He'd given his coat to Edie when the rain set in. The coat, in whose pocket he'd put the dragon's head. "Bugger," he said. Spout cocked his head. "Gaga?" "Exactly," said George.
"Gaga?"
"Yeah, gackly." He must be getting hysterical. Laughter was rising like a tide inside him, and there was nothing funny about any of this. And then he couldn't stop the laughter, not even as Spout adjusted his grip and launched himself off the top of the chimney into the great gulf of air below. Tears of mirth streamed into his eyes as the gargoyle swooped low over the river, heading north. Gackly. I'm guggered. The walker emerged with a pop from the small glass mirrors in his hands and looked up at the classical front portico of Tate Britain, and then turned round. There was no one to be seen except for people waiting for a bus on the other side of the road. He approached the grey steps and hurried up the left-hand side of the wide stairway. He'd come to visit one new statue. A hybrid, because not all statues are either spits or taints. This was both. Two muscular men were struggling with a huge and murderous bull, on whose back a naked woman was tied. The human statues were spits, the bull a taint. "I want to talk to the bull." No one moved. The frozen moment of struggle remained paralysed in mid-air. The walker sighed. "It's the Minotaur." The bull's eye swiveled and looked at him. "He has been killed." The bull convulsed and threw the two men into the corner of the balcony. The woman, tied to its back, screamed. The bull stood there, snorting angrily, as the woman struggled to free herself. "I wondered if you'd like to help me punish the ones responsible." The bull tossed its head and horns back, and then drowned the woman's screams in the primal bellowing it blasted up into the night sky. The walker looked up and smiled as a darker shape dropped out of the night and landed gently on his shoulder. "Ah, there you are." The raven clacked its beak in his ear. He nodded. "Good. If they're to be found, the tallyman will do it quicker than anything else. Now, come. We must go east." Edie angled down towards the river, and as she did so, she caught sight of the street name bolted to the building on the corner. She was walking down Puddle Dock, and at that moment she heard a voice say very clearly, "One glint, top of Puddle Dock, walking down to the river." She turned. It was just a tramp, wearing a long coat, his head framed in rough sleeper's dreadlocks. He stared back as if he was waiting for her to do something. Then a tiny shudder twitched through him, and he shrugged. "One glint, top of Puddle Dock, standing in the middle of the road." He sounded almost disembodied. He had the look of a man who'd zombified himself beneath relentless waves of alcohol. She decided he was deeply drunk, so, keeping out of the reach of any sudden lunge she might make, she took a couple of steps towards him. "What do you say?" "One glint, top of Puddle Dock, standing still in the middle of the road." "Why do you call me a glint?" she asked. "Because you are a glint." "And who are you?" His tongue roiled wetly in the stump-scattered ruin of his mouth. "We are the tallyman." "We?" she said, looking round. She was relieved to see he was alone. "You're a we, are you? Like the Queen?" "We are the tallyman," he said, uninterested, immovable eyes locked on her. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Counting you. One glint, top of Puddle Dock, standing still in the middle of the road." "Why are you counting me?" "We are the tallyman." It wasn't his tone that made her feet suddenly feel like they were glued to the tarmac. It was his eyes, no longer squinting, because they weren't man's eyes. They were entirely black, eyes with no whites at all, dark and beady and inhuman as a raven's eyes. And she was filled with the horrible conviction that more than just the tramp was staring at her out of them. She wrenched her feet into motion and darted between a car and a shrieking dispatch rider and sprinted towards the river. The tallyman didn't run after her. He just spoke calmly as he waited for a hole in the traffic. "One glint, running down Puddle Dock, towards the river." "Whoso lists to hunt, I know where there is an hind." The walker's words seemed to hang in the dank air, long after he left the gunner alone in the darkness. The gunner was sick with the certainty that the walker would hunt Edie and get her. There had been just too many heartstones belonging to other glints arranged on the four walls of the underground water tank like grisly trophies to leave any room for doubt about it. Each of those worn pieces of sea glass had been the precious possession of a woman or girl, the kind none would have given up without a fierce fight. The gunner wondered how many of the heartstones had been pried from cold, dead fingers. Feeling for the wall behind him, he slid down to a sitting position, hunched against the damp stone at his back. Then he took an inventory of how he felt and what his options were. He felt wrong inside, which he realized was the result of having broken his oath in order to try and save Edie. This wrongness made him weak, and it seemed to be making it hard for him to think as straight as he normally did. The thing he was most worried about, after what was going to happen to Edie and George without him there to help them, was what was going to happen at midnight. Midnight, or turn of day, was the time when the statues based on real people, the spits, had to be on their plinths. An empty plinth at turn of day meant the death of a spit. When it returned, it never walked again, and became no more than a human-shaped lump of metal or stone. Since he was now paying the penalty for breaking an oath sworn by the stone and the hand that made him, he imagined midnight might mean the start of an eternity of wandering, like the walker, enthralled to the dark powers pent in the stone itself. "Come on, you dozy beggar," he said to himself, as he grunted and heaved himself back onto his feet. If the glint's glasses blazed into life because of their power to warn when a taint or a stone servant like the walker came near, and that was the perverse way the walker provided light for himself in his subterranean lair, there was something that he could do, and the fact that it involved disassembling the walker's carefully made castle shapes only increased his desire to do it. He unhooked his tarpaulin cape and felt for the mural on the wall behind him. He carefully laid the cape on the gravel beneath the castle outline, and reached high and wide, using both hands to brush the glass pieces off the wall and onto the tarpaulin. "Abracadabra to you too, mate," he muttered, in grim satisfaction. Once he'd convinced himself that he'd cleared that wall of heartstones, he bundled up the tarpaulin, turned 180 degrees to the wall, and walked in a straight line off the gravel spit and into the water. As he passed the centre point of the space, he stopped and cast round with his hands in the air until they clattered into the spinning disc on the chain. He tugged hard, and there was a percussive spang noise as the chain parted and the disc came free. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his matches. He lit one and stood there, hip deep in the water, looking at the disc in the light of the small flame. It was an old pewter plate. On it, someone had scratched a series of concentric circles with turreted castles round the edge. A road led from an arch in the base of each castle, and they made a cross where they met in the centre of the plate, joined by another series of circles. There was writing all over the design, but all the gunner had time to read was "The King and His Princes" and "Occidens" before the match guttered out. He carefully stowed the plate inside his jacket and headed for the glass castle on the wall facing him. And though there was no one to see him, he grinned as he reached for the first piece of sea glass on the wall ahead. At the same time Edie was running south towards the river, George had just recrossed it heading north. Spout held him firmly round the chest as he flapped towards the great dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a jerky passage through the air, as the gargoyle grunted and flexed its muscles on each downbeat, swaying precariously from stroke to stroke. The flash of a camera caught George's eyes as they overflew a gaggle of tourists taking pictures in the dwindling light in front of the cathedral. He shouted, "Help!" but just as he'd expected, not a single tourist looked up. They couldn't see him in his lair of London. Because he gave up expecting anyone to notice him, he missed the wiry old broken-toothed man sitting on the ground in a doorway. He didn't see him put down the cider bottle and squint into the sky at him. And nor did he see the jet-black eyes or hear the lifeless voice saying, "One boy, in a sky, carried by a gargoyle, flying around St. Paul's heading north-northeast." George caught a smeared vision of a strangely familiar arched gatehouse, and then, unaccountably, he heard a noise so out of place that he looked wildly around for the source, the sound of sheep, bleating plaintively. Suddenly they climbed up and over the office building ahead of them, too quickly to be certain, but just slowly enough for George to be almost convinced he heard a voice amidst the sheep shout after him, "Hold on, my son!" He twisted and wriggled in Spout's clasp, desperately trying to see the sheep or the man whose voice he was heartbreakingly sure that he had both heard and recognized, but the gargoyle flew on over the rooftops, and the square was lost to his view. It had only been a snatch of sound, but it had gone through him like a burst of adrenaline. He felt an unaccountable surge of well-being coursing round him. He snatched a look at the 3 lines twisting down to his wrist. Unless he was mistaken, they'd travelled further, one of them actually crossing his wrist and starting a curving fissure onto his forearm. "Gaven!" croaked Spout suddenly, and there was a swooping heave, and the world tilted alarmingly. George looked upwards to see what was troubling the gargoyle, and saw that Spout's neck was craned backwards. Then the world bucked and roller-coasted once more, and George realized that Spout was taking evasive action, diving down between 2 skyscrapers to get below the roof level, as if trying to put them between him and something else in the evening sky. He craned round and followed the direction of the gargoyle's eyes, but the sky was empty, apart from a large crow, or some such bird, flapping slowly north in the distance. There was nothing, obviously threatening. George couldn't see why Spout was acting so strangely. "Gaven!" panted the gargoyle. And then they swooped over the rooftops of a large, older building, and he caught a glimpse of the pillared frontage of the Royal Exchange building to the right, and realized they must be flying directly over the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street. He looked down and saw the dark hollow of the central courtyard, and then he heard a clear girl's voice singing. It was coming from the top of a small dome on the sharp angle of the building to the north. The singer was a bright splash of gold against the grey of the building. She was balanced like a ballet dancer on the toes of one slender foot, while her other leg stuck out behind in a dainty arabesque. Golden drapery shimmered round her, as if blown by an invisible breeze that ruffled her gilded hair as she sang. And for an instant she was a vision of poise and grace and happiness. And then, just as George saw her, she saw him, and though her mouth stayed open, she stopped singing and stared at him in unfeigned surprise as Spout flapped past. And it seemed to George that her face shone, more than just because it was gold. It shone because her eyes were bright and full of hope, and something that made him uncomfortable, though not in a necessarily bad way. "A boy?" she said. "Hello, boy." And then, as Spout kept on flying away from her, her smile changed to a small, sad pout, and she traced a half-wave with her hand. "Goodbye, boy." "Help!" shouted George. Spout hissed in disapproval, and then she was lost to sight behind the angle of the next building. Spout was looking back too, and something he saw didn't please him at all, because he suddenly hissed even louder, dropped a shoulder, and curved in and down behind a tall office building with the sudden jerking swoosh of a skier abruptly swerving to a halt. His talon reached out and grabbed the parapet, and he neatly pinwheeled himself to a stop, flattened against the sloping roof of greasy greenish-grey tiles. His wings were spread out like a partial umbrella, and George was stuck between them and the angle of the roof. For a long minute they stayed there unmoving. The only sound was Spout panting and George's heart hammering. He looked down and saw his feet were braced on a slippery gutter above a lethal drop to the street below. He noticed for the first time he had only one shoe on, because his sock immediately became soaked. And then Spout did something terrifying. He let go of George. George scrabbled with his hands, and then realized the only way not to fall was to flatten himself on the sheer angle of the roof and hope the guttering didn't give way. He stopped scrabbling and pressed forward. Spout kept his eyes on him and nodded slowly. He pointed one claw warningly at George. And then he reached up and slowly began to crawl to the edge of the roof above. His ears were flattened back in his head, like some great hunting cat. George wondered what it was that was frightening the gargoyle. He saw Spout cat-crawl to the roof ridge and slowly slide halfway over. He paused in that position, only one leg and the edge of a wing still visible to George, ready to duck back into hiding if his search of the sky revealed something alarming. George concentrated on keeping a grip on the distressingly sheer slope of the roof. He thought he'd be okay if he didn't make any sudden movements. He was pretty sure he could be still, especially since the consequences of not being still were going to be moving very quickly downwards and then being still forever. He concentrated on sticking to the roof. He was going to be able to do this. He felt his hands splayed against the slates. He saw the greenish flecks on the grey surface in front of his nose. He felt the stone under his fingertips. Maybe because he was concentrating so hard on staying stuck to them, he somehow felt that he could feel the structure of the stone itself, the tight grain, the compressed layers that made it possible to split it into the thin roof tiles. He was so taken by the immediacy and intensity of what he was feeling beneath his hand that he forgot to be scared. And then something tapped him on the ankle. He jerked away on reflex and nearly tumbled into the street. He flattened against the tiles, trying to become part of the roof again, hoping that every extra bit of him that he could press against the surface would help him stick there. Even his face was squidged against the cold slate. "Are you perchance trying to hold on with your nose?" said a tiny whisper behind him. He looked down and saw the golden girl looking back up at him, both elbows perched on the gutter, chin cupped in her hands, as nonchalant as if leaning on a bar, despite the fact there was nothing but a lethal gulf of air beneath her feet. His eyes automatically flicked upwards to see if Spout had heard her. All he could see was the one talon on the ridge and the bit of wing. Spout was still on lookout. The girl pushed herself off from the gutter and held on with her hands, arms at full stretch, looking up at him. "Come," she said, and held out one hand. "Who are you?" whispered George. "I am minister of your fate," she said. And then she tugged his ankle off the gutter. He didn't have time to yell or grab a handhold. He just fell, snatching handfuls of air, and... She caught him. "Shh," she whispered, mouth pressed close to his ear, breath warm on the back of his neck. One finger pointed at Spout's back on the ridge line above them. He nodded. "Hold on, boy," she breathed. She let go of the building edge and fell slowly backwards with the clean grace of an Olympic high diver, and George went along with her. Suddenly they were diving face first to the paving stones beneath. He opened his mouth to shout, but her free hand clapped over it and stifled the yell, and all he could see racing towards his bulging eyes was granite oblivion. Edie trotted downhill, turned right, and saw the white triangular shape of the Blackfriar pub jutting towards the Thames like the prow of a landlocked ship. She stopped and stood staring at the pub facade, not at what was on it, but rather at what wasn't. The clock below was still stuck at 5 to 7, but above it, where the statue of the Black Friar normally stood like a figurehead, was a blank plinth. The friar was gone, and the empty space stared back at Edie like a threat. She jogged across the road and under the railway bridge as a train rumbled ominously overhead. She rounded the point of the building and slowed, suddenly wary. The door to the pub stood open, but the lights were off. As she approached it, she saw two builders carry out a stack of planks and load them into the back of a white van fly-parked on the curb. She flattened herself against the side of the building and went very still, concentrating on not being seen. Not being seen was a skill she'd realized she was good at very early on in her life. She knew she wasn't actually invisible, but she also knew that she had something that made people's eyes slide off her, as if she was covered in non-stick coating. She waited for the men to go back inside the pub, then slid quickly up to the open door and pressed her back against the outside wall. She slipped the frosted circle of sea glass out of her pocket and checked it. It was dull and unthreatening, no inner fire kindling within to warn of the closeness of danger. Slipping it back into her coat, she felt the heavy lump of the dragon's head in George's pocket bump against her thigh. Before she could think more about this, the builders came back out, knees buckling under the weight of a second, bigger stack of planks. They walked it right past her, and she pivoted neatly and slipped inside into the gloom. She heard the rear door of the van slam, and feet heading back towards her. She lifted the edge of a cloth and bent double beneath a low pub table. She heard one man walk back into the room, switch off the lights, and then walk out again. The door was pulled shut, and keys turned in the lock. After about 5 minutes, she rolled out from under the table and walked towards the bar. She shrugged out of George's jacket and put it on the countertop as she boosted herself up onto it, swiveled her legs over, and dropped onto the barman's side. "Oi! Tragedy!" she called. "I need some straight answers." Silence. She made a point of not looking into the dark alcove beyond the 3 low arches to her right. To the trained ear, it was entirely clear that this was where all the silence was coming from. "I know you're there." Silence. And then, just as she was opening her mouth to speak again, another voice dodged quietly out from under the arches. "No, I ain't." Edie hid a smile. "Where's the friar?" she asked. "He's not here at all." "What, you're both not here?" "No. Yes. Yes. Only he's more not here than what I am, see?" A tousled head of bronze hair poked into view at the top of one of the arches, hanging upside down, and then a face dropped into view, the impish face of a street cherub, carrying a mask which the sculptor had carved into the distinctive features of tragedy. "You're in a pickle," he said. "Biggest pickle in a barrel's what I heard." Heard from who? Dunno. He dropped the floor and looked at her.
You get all sorts in a pub. Keep your ears out when you pick up a lot of stuff. Trouble is, I've seen so many things for so long, I'll get it all in the ball, like knots. It all gets tangled. Like, I think I remember stuff I ain't supposed to have seen, and I've seen things I ain't supposed to remember. And that's not even counting the stuff I definitely ain't seen, don't remember, and can't forget. You know what I mean?
No.
Well, I've got so much stuff in my head, I can't keep it all apart. It all gets jumbled. It's one of the things that make me feel like I'm made wrong,
There was a small gust of wind from behind her. It rustled a newspaper left on the stool beside him. He reached out and caught the top sheet as it lifted off the pile. He held it as if surprised to find it there. Then he scowled intently at it and crumpled it into a ball that he kept bunched tight in his hand, and smiled hopefully at her. Edie could see there was something not right. The suspicion was creeping up on her that he might have a dual nature. Maybe he was taintish when he had the mask on, spit-like when he didn't. She changed the subject back to the reason she'd returned to the pub. I need to find the gunner, and I need to find George. I don't even know where to start except this one thing. What's in the mirrors? He looked perplexed.
What mirrors?
She pointed to the two mirrors on either side of the arch he was standing in. They faced each other on the inside of the arch, and standing between them gave the impression that the reflections repeated themselves to infinity. Those mirrors. I need to know about them. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, avoiding her eyes.
Well, they're just mirrors. That's all they are.
She turned on him, hand clenched into a fierce and knobby fist. I want to know about the mirrors, because I think it's to do with them, isn't it? When we left here, I looked in, and it was all like this, hundreds of reflections of the same thing, snaking off into the distance, all copies of each other, except for one thing. Her finger stabbed at the mirror. He flinched as a hand passed his shoulder, but his eyes followed the direction she was indicating. It's not there now, but it was. There was one slice that was different to all the others. And you know why.
No, I don't want to know in all.
He was backing into the shadows again.
Tragedy. Stay there.
She followed him into the gloomy nook.
The rest of the slices were identical to each other, just getting smaller. But there was this one slice with a bowl and a knife lying on the ground, only that's what I thought they were, until I saw them again. Later.
Little Tragedy's eyes slid round the room, looking for an exit, or help.
You saw them later? This bowl and knife, what's it?
She nodded. She could tell that she was on the threshold of something new, something powerful. I saw them again, just after this evil bloke called the Walker pulled two little round mirrors out of his pocket and stepped into one of them. I saw them just after he disappeared into the mirror, taking our friend with him. Only it wasn't a bowl and a knife. It was the Walker's dagger and the gunner's tin helmet, and they lay there on the ground, and these two little mirrors hung there in the air on either side of them for a moment like a magic trick. Then there was a little pop, and the mirrors and the hat and the dagger just sort of disappeared. So what I need to know is, are these the kind of mirrors you can step into? And if they are, how come I saw that hat and dagger lying there just before it happened? Said Little Tragedy.
Well,
His eyes were sliding all over the room.
You should ask himself. I only see stuff, really. Ask old Black.
I'm asking you. He's not here. Tragedy looked at the newspaper crumpled in his hand, then placed it delicately on the tabletop. She flashed the memory of him catching the paper as it lifted off the pile in the gust of wind from the door, and only then remembered the door was shut. Had been shut. Locked. Tight enough to keep drafts out. Little Tragedy grimaced again, as if knowing what she was belatedly realizing. The hairs on the back of her neck went up. Her hand reached instinctively for the warning glass in her pocket. The deep booming voice behind her froze her hand.
The little imp is trying to say, yes, he is.
She turned, knowing what she was going to see. She was nose to belly with the friar himself, towering over her like a dark cliff face. And as her eyes travelled upwards, she couldn't help but notice that the previously jolly face was as cheery and welcoming as a black thundercloud in a cold, dark sky. CD 2. George plummeted towards the ground, held in the tight embrace of the Golden Girl. At the very last moment she flattened out her dive and swooped left in a 90-degree barrel roll. George stared at the paving stones whipping past his nose and got used to being alive again. Then he made the mistake of looking forward. The intersection ahead was busy. Buses and lorries sped through in opposite directions, and the girl seemed to be leaving it much too late if she hoped to fly over the vehicles. A high-sided lorry hurtled in from the left on a certain collision course, much too close to miss or avoid. George knew he was dead. But instead of hitting the lorry, she dinked even lower and underflew it between the moving wheels. He heard her laughter gurgle in his ear as she banked left and up. When she flew, she really flew. Unlike Spout, who dragged himself painfully across the sky by grabbing great untidy chunks of air and forcing them beneath his wings, the girl didn't fight the air. She flew in it, as if she was part of it. She circled into the pavement at the foot of a bulging, gherkin-shaped skyscraper and daintily released George and stepped back. "I guarantee we lost him," she said. He looked upwards and was pleased to see no sign of Spout. "Thank you," she smiled. "It was nothing more than a pleasure, boy." "My name's George," he said. He held out his hand. She looked at him oddly and then took it. But instead of shaking it, she turned it over and examined it. He saw she was looking at the scar, the dragon's wound, his maker's mark. "Oh," he said, "that's a—" "I know what it is, boy. Being one of the maid, how could I not?" "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Ariel." George remembered that Ariel was the spirit of the air, because his school had been to see a play in a park 2 summers ago. Well, no offence, but I thought Ariel was a boy." Her head came up and she looked at him with an expression that was half hurt, half outraged pride. "No, I mean, when we saw it in school, Ariel was a boy, in the play, right?" "Do I look like a boy to you, boy?" "No, you look very not like a boy." Suddenly George's frustrations came bubbling to the surface. "Ariel, I've got friends in trouble and they need help, and I need help to help them because they're my responsibility, yeah? Please, Ariel, I have to do what has to be done. What I really need to know is, can you help me?" He ran out of words. She smiled at him. "Of course, to help do what has to be done. That's why I came for you. I'm a minister of fate." She tugged his arm, and then they were flying again, north, up the street known as St. Mary Axe. And then, ahead of them, somewhere in the darkness, he heard a single bell tolling, as if for a funeral, deep and low and solemn. And he knew with absolute certainty that it was a warning bell, and that the warning was for him. The Icarus flapped its rigid wings and gave a series of short, muted shrieks of agony as it flew over the office buildings that made up the Broadgate development. It was screaming because it hated people. It preferred the safety of its plinth, where it could stay hunched inside the contraption that attached it to its wings. The wings it had been given were like ragged, sawn-off windmill sails, and this meant it could only fly short distances without exhaustion, and never got higher than about 6 meters off the ground. It was shrieking particularly intensely because the length it had tried to fly was too ambitious, and it was going to have to land in the middle of the crowd of people, dressed up and heading off for a night out. Its hatred of human beings was so intense that it had convinced itself, somewhere in the back of its mad mind, that the closer they came to him, the more it hurt. He landed in front of the only group of unmoving people amid the flow, 6 black figures cast from bronze. The taint stood in front of them, panting and sobbing, as it flinched from any contact with the people passing. The real reason the Icarus was mad was because it didn't know who or what it was, man, machine, animal, or bird. The only other creature who had ever been able to soothe it was the Minotaur, because the Minotaur had been made by the same maker and had the same mad split at its core. The boy in the glint had killed the Minotaur, so the Icarus would hunt them down, no matter how much the hunting hurt. It took a great ragged breath and launched itself into the sky. It would find them. The gunner's wrongness seemed to be getting worse. He felt tired beyond normal exhaustion, and his hands and limbs were beginning to not do what he wanted them to. He wiped his now clumsy hands across the rough stone of the wall, and confirmed to his satisfaction there were no more heartstones left on it. Then, grinning, He hefted the oilskin bag that his ground-sheet cape had become. It clinked satisfactorily. He had two choices. He could drop the bag under water, which would leave the walker floundering around in the dark, trying to find the heartstones. The only trouble with that was the tank floor was barely 2 meters below water at its deepest points, and a lot shallower over most of its area. Floundering around would eventually lead the walker to trip over the package, and then, when he opened it, he would have all the light he could want.
So, bury it, he grunted.
He stumbled up onto the spit of gravel, found the back wall, and dropped to his knees. He put the bag of heartstones on the ground next to him and pulled the pewter plate out of his jacket.
"Know what you are?" he said. "A bloody short-handed shovel."
He chunked the plate into the pea gravel at his knees, hoisted a plateful of stone to one side, and dug in again, pleased to see that the walker's injunction forbidding him to dig up wasn't preventing him digging in the opposite direction. And, as is so often the way of it, once he was working, he felt less tired. He knew he had plenty to worry about, not least of which was that he was running out of time. Turn of day must be approaching up on the surface, and if his plinth was empty at midnight, he knew he was a goner. The thought turned his gut, and he took it out on the gravel by digging faster and harder. Whatever happened, even if he kicked the bucket at midnight, he was going to bury the walker's profane booty as deep as he could. The Black Friar glowered down at Edie.
"Where's the boy?"
"Gone," she said.
"Gone how? Gone where?"
"Don't know how. Thought you might know why."
"Sunder me from my bones, girl. I assure you it's nothing to do with me."
"He found the stone heart," said Edie. "It was the London stone. But he chose not to put the dragon's head on it. He chose the hard way. Is that why he disappeared?"
"You're telling me he actually chose the hard way? Trophies and trumpetings, why would he do that, unless—"
The friar looked at Little Tragedy, then at Edie.
"Tell me everything. Leave nothing out, and then we'll see what we can see, and mayhap do what can be done."
Edie sat down on a stool, and, suddenly very conscious the broken dragon's head was in the pocket of George's coat, only centimetres from the friar's elbow, started to talk. She told him of everything that had happened since they left this room the night before, omitting only the fact the broken dragon's head was close by. She ended on the gunner being spirited into the mirrors by the walker. "And that's why I want to know about the mirrors. That's why I want to know about the hard way. I have to find George, and then we have to help the gunner." The friar rubbed his chin with one hand. Then he looked off to one side at the mirrors.
"I'll make you a deal," he said. "Something for you, something for me."
"What kind of something?" she asked, trying hard not to look at the coat on the bar top, with its suspiciously bulging pocket.
"I want your word that if the boy lives and you find him, you'll bring him to me."
"You want George?"
"I want to talk to him. I want him to talk to me."
"And that's all?" asked Edie.
"That's all."
She didn't need to think. "Deal." The friar sat back with a smile, and for an instant she wondered if she had just, unwittingly, betrayed George in some way. George heard the bell tolling ahead of them, deep, regular, and doom-laden. Ariel flew straight, as if locked onto the source of the noise, missiling through the sheets of rain now gusting down. She flew over black metal railings and a spiked gate looming between worn stone gatehouses, and on into an inner courtyard, backed by a modern glass-fronted office building. She swerved and landed so delicately that it wasn't clear where flying ended, and walking resumed. The tolling of the bell was very loud against the white noise of the rain coming down like stair rods. She pointed to something red and boxy high on the wall of one of the buildings, but because the rain was falling directly into his upturned eyes, it took George a couple of seconds to realize that it was the bell and its mounting. A fire bell at one time, it now rang its relentless funeral note. He knew he wasn't going to like the answer to his next question, but he asked it anyway. "What's that about? Why are we here?" Ariel smiled brightly at him, spun on her toe in a single pirouette, and came back round without a hint of a smile or laughter in her eyes. "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, boy. It tolls for thee." "Okay," he said. "But why is it for me?" She stretched a long arm out with a theatrical flourish, and pointed over his shoulder. "It is a summoning bell. It is summoning you to meet the last night." He turned slowly. 10 meters away, on a raised patch of grass surrounded by a low box hedge, was a full-sized knight in armor, sitting on a fierce-looking mount, carrying a long lance at the ready. The knight's helmet covered his face except for a narrow slit in his visor, and the horse wore a surcoat made of interlinked plates of metal, set with round discs of blue glass at the centre of each one. They made a majestic pair, though there was something skeletal about the horse's head. In fact, the horse wasn't solid at all. It was hollow. And then George looked more closely and saw that the sculptor had made both the man and the horse out of plates of armour. The knight was a hollow man, which raised the question of whether he was a spit or a taint. "Ariel," said George, "why is the bell summoning me exactly?" "You chose your own fate, boy. You picked the hard way. And that starts here." George had been pretty sure the hard way had begun when he was knocked into the sky by Spout, if not even earlier, when the gunner had been taken from them. He didn't like the idea that that had been just a warm-up for something much worse. "And who is the last knight?" "He is the last knight of the Knickton Guild." "The what?" "They are a guild of knights, spelt the old-fashioned way." She pointed behind him. "That writing over there explains it." There was a plaque on the shallow wall beneath the hedge surrounding the knight. He walked slowly forward, keeping an eye on the knight and his charger, as he went down on one knee in the rain-splashed puddle in front of the plaque and read, "King Edgar, 959 to 975, granted this derelict land to 13 knights, on condition that they each perform 3 duels, one on land, one below land, and one on water. These feats having been achieved, the king gave the knights, or Knickton Guild, certain rights." He got no further, because the horse stamped its hooves, and he looked up to see the knight leaning forward. "Will you stand?" he said. George straightened up and wiped the rain from his face. "Yes." "Hello." "And will you stand?" repeated the knight. George looked up at the blue light staring out instead of eyes from within the blank helmet. The horse pulled against its reins and pawed the ground with great metal hoof. "Here I am, standing," he answered, a little puzzled. The knight pulled at the horse's bridle, which made it snort and stop the pawing. "And then will you stand?" The repetition was getting strange. I am standing. I do stand, as you see. You've asked me that 3 times already." "And you have accepted 3 times. Good night." George decided the statue was obviously a bit mad. "Yes, well, good night to you too," he said, and turned away. "Ha!" The next toll of the bell was augmented by a simultaneous roar and clash of arms. The sound hit him like a physical blow. It was a shout of approval, and it came from many more throats than just the last knight. It was the sound of a great host shouting and hitting their shields with swords and lances. And in a flash of something like lightning, George saw the guild gathered round him, like ghostly projections on the rain. But these were no brightly coloured fairy-tale knights from a child's book. These were grim combat-worn figures, clinging to their saddle-horns with the last of their strength. Their armour and chain-mail were hacked up and skeined with blood. Their sword-edges were nicked. Their shields bore so many gouges that it was hard to make out the heraldic designs that had once been painted on them. Those that carried their helmets had faces grizzled with stubble, and dark-shadowed eyes stained with battle-weariness. To complete the sense that they had all just paused in battle, breath panted out of their mouths and the nostrils of their horses. George saw all of this in a flash, and when it was gone, the modern buildings reasserted themselves, and he was staring at Ariel, still with his back to the night. One thing that had changed, however, was that there seemed to be hundreds of bright blue lights radiating out from behind him, making a starburst on the surrounding walls of the courtyard. "He meant good night with a K," said Ariel. "And what does that mean exactly?" asked George. "It means his honouring you as a fellow knight for accepting the 3 challenges. It's chivalry." "It's rubbish," hissed George, desperate. "I didn't accept any bloody challenge, let alone 3. "Yes, you did, boy. You agreed to stand. You agreed 3 times. "But I didn't know what he was saying." "Ha!" The bell tolled, and there was another intense flash and sound of a host shouting, and George saw the guild again. They were moving in, making a long alley on either side of him. "Good luck, boy," said Ariel, and walked backwards away from him. "What am I meant to do?" he said. "Stand and fight. 3 duels, 3 trials of strength, none to be fought on the same ground as any other. You must fight on the earth, under the earth, and on the water. You read the plaque. That is the way of the guild.
Why must I fight? Because in choosing the hard way, you chose to remain. Now you must prove you are worthy to.
Another toll of the bell, and this time a flash with no shout, just a vision of the knights. It carried on happening every time it rang. It was like seeing them in a very slow strobe, a tempo dialed down to the funeral toll of the bell. Ariel pushed up his sleeve and tapped the metal floor twining out from the maker's mark. Each of these floors will start to move towards your heart when you begin a duel. They do this to make you finish each contest, for if you run away, the floor will continue up your arm and pierce your heart. So do not run away from any of the duels. You must stand and prove yourself. Only in that way will you show what you're made of. Desperation was making his breath come faster. But I can't fight. I don't have a weapon. She smiled, a sad smile of farewell, and pointed behind him. Then pray that your wits are sharper than his lance, boy, because here it comes. He turned, and in the next flash saw the Knickton Guild had now hemmed him into a narrow jousting space that bristled with weapons and fierce-looking faces, and at the other end of the gauntlet he saw the source of all those blue lights. It was the knight and his charger. The blue glass discs that were interlinked in the horse's surcoat had each lit up, lancing light in all directions as the knight spurred the charger slowly forward off the dais. The lights bounced and waved hypnotically on the surrounding walls and windows, mirroring the sinuous rippling of the surcoat as the great horse stepped daintily over the low hedge, one hoof after the other clopping onto the wet stone floor of the courtyard. The knight was shrugging his shoulders and rolling his head on his neck, like a boxer loosening up before a fight. He looked every bit as murderous and businesslike as the rest of the guild did in the flashes that George kept seeing every time the bell tolled. He kept moving back, roughly along the alley made by the now visible, now invisible knights. He wondered if they were actually there all the time, or only when the flashes happened. He stepped sideways, planning to run into the low brick colonnades where the knight would be too tall to follow him easily, and he could at least grab one of the metal chairs to use as a weapon. Something hard, like the flat of a sword, smacked his head and made it ring. Being hit was perhaps the thing that saved him. It spikes adrenaline and makes you very angry, and George got very angry very quickly. He remembered the gunner, just after he'd first saved George, way back at the beginning of their nightmare journey, when he looked down on him and said, "You're angry. Sometimes angry gets things done. This ain't one of those times." But he also remembered the way the gunner had channeled his fury when fighting the Minotaur. That had been one of the other times when angry did get things done, and this, he knew, was the same kind of time. "Okay," he said to himself. "Fine." He turned, rolled up his sleeves, and set his legs a shoulder's width apart. The gunner may have been physically absent, perhaps lost forever, but there was definitely something of him in the way George planted his feet and held his ground. "Fine," he shouted. "Do your worst." There was a flash, and in it he saw the guild again, and they were all looking at him. "Anyone going to lend me a shield or something?" called George. In another flash he saw no one moving. It just made him angrier. "Good. Nice chivalry. Hell with you all." He felt the scar in his hand twinge, and he knew without looking that what Ariel had described had started. The metal floor had jagged up his arm and was heading for his heart. He looked at his hand and held the maker's mark out for them to see, and then he showed it to the knight. "I am a maker. You might not want me to get my hands on you." He was, of course, bluffing, but bluff was all he had going for him. The knight stopped and cocked his helmet. "Show me the hand." George's spirits rose. Maybe the bluff was going to work, though he had no idea why it would. He held his hand up. "You carry the mark," boomed the knight. "Yes, I do," said George. "I do carry it." "The mark of the Iron Hand," continued the knight. The bell tolled on the next flash of light, and in it George saw the Knickton Guild craning forward in their saddles for a closer look. He felt he was getting somewhere. Trying to sound like he had a clue what he was saying, he called, "Yes, that's right. I am the Iron Hand." "An Iron Hand," said the knight. "There have been many. You have the mark that says you may be one. Only time, your ordeals, and how you face them will tell." "So me being an Iron Hand makes a difference, right? Means we don't have to fight." The knight lowered his lance and aimed it right at George's chest. "It means you are a worthy adversary. Now, have at you!" He jagged his spurs into the horse's side, and the horse bunched muscle and leapt forward. There was another shout and clash of arms, and the freeze-framed Connington guild hemmed George in, and all he could see was nowhere to run, and the sharpened lance point barrelling in towards him like an express train through the rain. The walker paced back and forth on the corner of Berry Street and St. James's Court. His hands were clasped behind his back, and as he walked, his head was cricked to one side, watching himself. He was looking at his reflection in the highly polished black granite stone adorning the corner of the building. The edge of the building had been sculpted so that a stylized steamship appeared to be ploughing its way out of the corner and into the street. The walker let his hand trail over the frozen bow wave the boat was making, a V of tight stone curls peeling off the facade like black wood shavings. The raven sat patiently watching him from its perch on the bowsprit of the boat, the only thing blacker than the granite around it, apart from its eyes. The eyes flickered, and then the raven hopped onto the walker's shoulders. "The eyes of the tallyman have seen something?" said the walker. The bird clacked its beak in its ear. The walker listened, and then nodded. "Puddle Dock, they say." He turned on his heel and walked back in the other direction. A glint. Walking down Puddle Dock, seeking succour or knowledge, would likely be on her way to see a friar. A black friar. He ran his hands over the black mirrored surface, as if testing it. Then he turned away with a snap. "Black is a lucky colour. Tell the tallyman where she is bound. Now she is found, it would pain me to have her lost again." Edie thought for a moment about the fact that she might have just betrayed George. It was a short thought, but a sharp one. And then the friar was talking and she was listening, and what he told her quickly pushed the uncomfortable thought to the back of her mind, into a place from which she could unpack it later. "The mirrors are gateways. Not all mirrors, just mirrors that are set up parallel with each other. They work in two ways. Firstly, by stepping into a mirror, a being may move himself from where he is to another place within the city, so long as there are parallel mirrors set up there too." "That's wild," said Edie, despite herself. "Oh, it's much more than wild, I assure you. It's much more than a mere transporter. It is very powerful, and it's very, very dangerous." "Why?" He stood up, the swiftness of his movements making her flinch, but he was only gesturing to her to take a position in the archway. "Stand there, between the mirrors. Do not touch them, because now you know what they can do. They may be open to you, but look." She saw the images of herself and the dimly lit bar concertinaing away into the distance. "You think you're seeing the reflections of yourself again and again, but you're not. You are seeing moments in time. Even a single reflection in a mirror is never yourself in the present, because it takes a thin slice of a microsecond for the light carrying the image to bounce off the mirror and back into your eye. A face in the mirror is always a face in the past, by that tiny fraction, and because of that, we never see ourselves as we are, only as we were." He smiled at her. "Look at the images of your face, repeating off to infinity. Each one seems the same, but that's only because the images you can see clearly are the ones where the differences are so minimal as to be beyond detection. Travel further through the layers, and you travel deeper into the past. Think about London. London is a place of power, and it was a place of power before people built their first shelter here. Look along the river. Look at the Tower of London. Ancient? It's a Johnny-come-lately. It was a Christian church, and before that a Roman temple, and before that a shrine to a Celtic crow god, and before that a shrine to a god with horns on his head, and before that, well, only the raven himself remembers. All pasts are still there, layered under the skin." He ducked through the arch next to her, and she turned, uncomfortable in the thought he might be trying to get behind her in the dark. "So the mirrors not only transport you through space," she said, "they can also move you through time, into past Londons." "You're quick, little girl." "I'm not a little girl. I'm a glint. I know all about the past." "And of course it holds no terrors for you." Edie rolled her eyes and blew her cheeks out at him in impatience. "It holds plenty of terrors for me. I'm just saying I can understand about being able to go to the past, because it's sort of what I do. I can get my head round that." "You don't seem impressed, child." "Well, not really. I've got enough trouble coping with this particular present. I don't need more of them. I mean, I hear what you're saying and all, but it's all just a bit crap." "What it sounds like to your young ears is something I have no control over, Glint. What it is..."
And here he raised his hands over his head and did something to the checkered circular mosaic in the ceiling. It looked as though he was moving two of the rings in different directions.
What it is, I can show you.
There was a crump and crunch, and the friar looked less like a monk and more like a demon as the shadows danced across his face, lit from below. The light casting these shadows was red and dancing like flames, and there had, a moment ago, been no flames in the room. Edie turned to see where the fire was coming from, and felt a great heat blast sear the side of her face. Then her eyes stopped as they swung past the mirror to her right, the mirror that had contained the endlessly repeating reflections of herself, and now contained a blast-furnace vision of hell, falling walls, and screaming people. The shock of it made her leap back, and for an instant she felt the cool glass of the other mirror behind her, and she heard the friar yell, "No! Stay away from the mirror!" And then the cool, hard glass at her back gave way, as gently as a soap bubble popping, and the world lurched as she started to fall through into a howling firestorm. And then something grabbed her foot, and that's when things really started to go wrong. The last knight barreled in through the rain, his lance aimed unwaveringly at George's heart. George backed up until he felt a wall behind him, and then he ducked and rolled sideways. He knew the invisible knights had him hemmed in, and had the throbbing face to prove how hard it would be to try and barge through their cordon. It was a thick, impenetrable wall of horses' bodies and shields and men with weapons. But he also noticed, when the knights became visible at the next flash and toll of the bell, that lower down, under the horses' bellies, there was plenty of space to escape, at ground level. So that's what he aimed for as he ducked and rolled for safety, hoping he wouldn't find a hoof in the way. His plan worked pretty well. As he rolled, the bell tolled in another flash, and he saw the belly of the horse above him, and then he hauled himself up on his feet. Sprinting across the courtyard to the relative shelter of the low brick colonnade, he heard a roar of disapproval from the Knickton Guild, and heard someone clearly shout, "Craven!" George ducked sideways, flattened himself against the inside of the pillar, and held his breath. In front of him was the plate-glass wall of a coffee bar. The bar was closed, but a girl was stacking chairs and wiping tabletops. She looked up as George saw, in the reflection of the shop window, the lights on the war horse's surcoat step slowly into the arch behind him. "You must fight," said the knight. "You must come out and fight, or you must forfeit, as a craven varlet." "I am fighting," said George. "I just don't have a weapon." A twinge of pain in the scar made him look down at his hand. He remembered how it had cut through the tentacled arm of the earth creature that had grabbed him in the underpass the day before. He remembered making the bullet that had killed the Minotaur. And then he looked at the lance that was tapping him on the leg. Somehow the tapping was too ignominious to bear. He thought of the power in his hands. He thought of how he had just been called Iron Hand. And then he moved. His hand flashed down and grabbed the lance about a third of a metre from the tip. It closed round the shaft of the lance, and he tried to put every ounce of strength and will into it. At the very least, he'd bend the thing and render it useless. But it neither snapped nor bent. And then the knight kicked his horse so that it sprang backwards, and he was dragged out into the open. As he was dragged, he suddenly had a horrible vision of what his hand would look like if he slid down the lance, and the blade at the end sliced it open. And without thinking, he let the fear in, and flinched. And as he flinched, the knight flicked the lance sideways, and sent him skimming across the rain-slick courtyard floor. George spun to his feet and looked for the next place to run. The bell tolled, and he saw the guild advancing behind him in a solid and ominous wall of armour. "You must stand," bellowed the knight. "You cannot run. Refuse to fight, and you forfeit." He pricked his horse forward and lowered his lance. George did the one other thing he hoped the knight wasn't expecting. He ran towards him. It had suddenly come to him, his dad in the park, a rugby ball, cold winter afternoons, and the words, "The trick is, zig, when they expect you to zag." The stutter step, the key to wrong-footing the tackler on the other team. His dad had spent hours trying to help him get the hang of it. Do it right, an hefty opponent closing in on you at speed didn't have enough room or mobility to change his direction in time to catch you. It was the perfect tactic. He focused on the tiny circle of the lance end as it sped towards him, and when it was 2 paces away, he jinked left but went right, and the lance tip tried to follow him and whiffled past his ear as he ducked and dug in, his left shoulder grazing along the side of the horse's mail as they passed. He reached the safety of another colonnade and looked back to see the big horse outlined by the office building beyond, sparks flying from its hooves as its skid sent up a huge backlit wall of spray.
He didn't wait to see them get their balance again. The bell tolled, and he saw in the accompanying flash that the guild were arranging themselves in another long line, cutting off his most obvious route to escape. But he also saw, at the end of their gauntlet, not a blank wall, but the sentry box gatehouses he'd flown in over with the Golden Girl. And beyond the gatehouses, the traffic and lights of the city beckoned. He didn't think twice, just tore past the sporadically visible wall of knights. Closing in on the open gate, he felt a jag of elation. 2 paces out, he allowed himself to look back. This meant he was facing the wrong way when the gate slammed shut. He hit it in a pile-driving shoulder charge. He hit it so fast and so unexpectedly that he saw stars whirling in front of his eyes. He turned and saw a flash of gold beyond the tightly arranged black bars of the gate. He couldn't believe it. "Ariel!" Her slender arm serpentined through the bars, and her hand found his upper arm. She squeezed it gently. "You cannot run. You cannot refuse the duel." He shook his head in disbelief. "You closed the gate? You? Open it!" She shook her beautiful golden head sadly. "I cannot, boy." The knight lowered his lance for the 3rd time and kicked the horse forward. Its hooves danced through the puddles, sending up great sheets of spray as it bore down on him. "But why?" he shouted, heart freezing at the sight of the inbound knight. "Because I am a minister of fate, and no one, absolutely no one, cheats fate, boy." The bell tolled its final note, and in the flash he saw the guild rise in their stirrups and shake their weapons to the sky in celebration of his death, as the fatal lance-tip sped in towards his heart. 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meter. He jerked his head away and closed his eyes as he sensed the wings of death flying in to gather him. He felt a tremendous impact, and he left the earth in one brutal, savage jerk. His spirit soared into the sky, and he opened his eyes, knowing he would see himself being drawn into the light. And instead he saw Spout looking down at him with his implacable stone eyes as he flapped into the night sky. "Back?" inquired the gargoyle, tightening his grip on George's chest as he swayed into another lopsided wing beat, circling north. George looked down, still half expecting this to be an out-of-body experience, still imagining he was going to be looking down on his own impaled body. And what he saw instead was the knight and the horse, and the lance thrust through the gate up to the hilt. And he also saw a figure writhing on the end of the weapon. Her golden shape was the last thing George saw before his eyes fluttered shut and unconsciousness swept in. In the darkness, the cold, the absence of hope, the gunner dug on. He was now so deep that he had one leg inside the hole and was bending and stretching as he dug, up to his waist in a gravel-ringed pool of his own excavating. And then he felt something moving around his ankles. It was the water in the pond. There was definite movement. The ghost of a current, barely there, but definitely present. The gunner didn't know it, but the current he was feeling was the pull of the Tyburn, one of the lost rivers of London, the one that gave its name to the place where London's criminals used to be hanged. And now it was exerting its dark pull at his ankles. He didn't know that, any more than he knew that he was standing in a lost medieval water tank below Marylebone. All he knew was that moving water meant a stream meant a channel for it to flow down, and a channel might, just might, mean a way out of this rat hole. He started digging with his hat. Now he really made progress. The hole deepened, and he was even able to feel the top of a low arch in the wall beginning to appear. As he dug, he realized something had blocked the exit pipe from the tank. As his hat suddenly skidded sideways, he found the reason, put his hat aside, and reached down. His first thought was that it was a tree root. Then it came away in his fist, and he had a sudden horrible feeling that he knew what it was. He shook his hands dry before lighting one of his precious matches. Staring back at him were the 2 wide-eyed sockets in the skull of a woman. He could tell it was a woman because there was a long hank of aubergine dark hair hanging off one side of the skull, and there was a gold ring glinting on a finger bone next to a small bundle. He reached in and moved the bundle, and another face smiled back at him. A doll's face. The skeleton was of a little girl, not a woman, and he knew, without needing to be told, that the girl was a glint, and that she was one of the walker's victims, possibly even his first. The little bone hand that clasped round the smiling doll's face did something to the gunner. It filled him with a murderous blackness. "Right, you bastard. Fate or no fate, I ain't bloody dying tonight. I'm coming after you." The King's Library sits off the west side of the great circular glass-domed courtyard of the British Museum. It's a long, elegant room, and the mixed collection of curios on display come from all the ages and regions of the world. To most people they look like a charming hodgepodge of collectible objects. Only a very few people know that there are things in this compendium of objects that are there because they keep each other in check, things of power, dark things and light things, cancelling each other out by the careful way they are arranged round one another. The lights were off, and the rest of the museum was silent. And then there was a very distinct popping noise, and the walker stepped out of one of his small mirrors. He reassembled them, snapping them together, face to face, and slipped the disc into the pocket of his coat. Standing in front of a tall display case, he feasted his eyes on the contents. Then, pushing back the hood of the green sweatshirt he wore beneath his flapping overcoat, he released the raven that had been travelling with him, and leant forward, both hands on the glass of the cabinet, staring at the contents. The raven flapped across to perch on the railing of the walkway that ran round the bookcase at the first floor level. Inside the glass cabinet were 3 big wax discs of different sizes, all as thick as cheeses, decorated with magical symbols: a small crystal ball, not much bigger than a golf ball, a thin gold disc, engraved with concentric circles and turrets like those on the pewter plate in the underground water tank, and, perhaps strangest of all, a mirror stone. Carved and polished from flawless black obsidian, the label described it as being of Aztec origin. The walker snorted. "Collectors with the brains of pygmy shrews." He knew this black stone mirror was old long before the Aztecs in Central America developed their strong taste for human sacrifices. He stared intently into the highly polished face of the stone, in shape just like a hand mirror, with a handle and a hole in it for a long perished thong. The walker splayed his hands against the glass opposite the circular crystal ball. He closed his eyes, and then peered into the dark, glassy surface of the mirror again. "The mirror is no use alone," he said. "Without its twin, it's little more than polished rock." He smiled darkly up at the raven. "An ordinary pair of glass mirrors will open a portal to wherever in the world you wish to go, if you have the knack. But a pair of stone mirrors can open a portal into another world entirely. And from that dark world a cunning man may bring powers the like of which this world has never seen. And they thought they would clip my wings by separating them, and hiding the other stone mirror where I have never found it. Yet it never occurred to them that with eternity spread ahead of me, I would have time to find a glint and a master maker to choose a stone and carve me a new one. Fools!" The crystal ball was beginning to spin inside the case, answering a hidden force emanating from the walker's spread fingers, and the faster it spun, the more it seemed to wobble on its axis. The walker's open hand snapped closed, and he lashed it back and forth. As he did so, the ball whipped and ricocheted around the interior of the glass cube. Suddenly all the glass in the cabinet shattered and fell to the floor. An alarm bell began to ring in the distance, and the dim lights came on. Ignoring all that, the walker stepped over the shards of glass and deftly snatched the ball from its now stationary position in mid-air at the centre of the case and pocketed it. His hands re-emerged, carrying 2 crumpled and mismatched gloves. He speedily put them on, and then, equally quickly, spread a scarf out and placed 2 of the protective wax discs on it. Then he picked up the obsidian mirror and put it on top of the discs, letting go of it as soon as he could, as if not wanting to touch it any longer than he had to, even though he was wearing gloves. Then he sandwiched it with another protective wax disc and tied the corners of the scarf tightly together, making a bundle. He pocketed the gold circle with the dream of 4 castles on it, and then stepped back. "Come," he said. The raven flew onto his shoulder. He held the ends of the scarf, wrapping the bundle containing the stone mirror in his teeth, as he exchanged gloves for mirrors in his pocket, and then, just as the first museum guard was running through the door, he stepped into one of his small glass mirrors and disappeared. Edie fell into the mirror behind her. She felt the surface bend and pop as delicately as a soap bubble, and then she was falling into the fire. As she fell, someone grabbed at her ankle, but they weren't able to hold it, and she hit the ground on her back and rolled. So the first things she saw were her legs in the air above her, and beyond them the dark sky and the bright disk of a full moon. And then she felt the sharp dig of a broken brick in her back, and she squirmed to her feet just in time to see long, bright white fingers of light sweep across the sky. It was only then that she became aware of the hellstorm of noise shaking the world around her. Deep explosions, crashes, screams. Behind the screams was the low moaning sound of a siren rising and falling, and behind that a rhythmic throbbing engine rumble from the sky. There was the sharper counterpoint of anti-aircraft fire from a hidden battery nearby, and others further off, and, mixed in all this, were urgent shouts and jangling ambulance bells, and huge earth-shaking thuds she could feel through the soles of her boots. Unwilling to look round at the source of all this horrifying sound, she looked at her feet, and saw they were on the step of a shop. There were fragments of brick and glass all around her. She looked to her side, and saw a mirror on the doorpost, and her face staring back at her. Suddenly there was a huge thump that knocked her to her knees as the ground buckled beneath her. When she looked up, stunned by the violence of the invisible blow, an infernal vision towered over the other end of the street, a firestorm. And out of the very centre of the flames rose the familiar dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, wreathed in conflagration and black smoke, but untouched. From the heat on her face and the pain in her shoulder, where she'd rolled on the half-brick, Edie knew that this was no vision. She wasn't glinting this. This was real. "Hey, you, girlie! Get off the bloody street! Get down the shelter!" A voice shrieked at her from the other side of the road. She turned to see a middle-aged man with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a tin hat like the gunner's. He was waving at her angrily. "It's that way! Down the end! You trying to get yourself killed, or—" The side of the ancient brick building behind him jerked, as if it had been kicked from the other side by an unseen giant. The man never got to what came after the "or," because the front of the building dropped on him in a brutally short avalanche of brick and stone. Edie put a hand over her mouth as the dust cloud rolled out. And then something grabbed her arm. She spun to see the friar. "Come!" he shouted, over the sound of another building crashing to the ground in the next street. "Back in the mirrors! You don't want to die here!" She let him drag her back towards the shop entrance, where she saw with relief 2 mirrors facing each other on either side of a bookshop window. That was their way out of this nightmare. Suddenly the friar stopped dead. She heard it an instant before it hit, a whistling sound from out of the chaotic sky overhead. The friar pulled her to him, enveloping her in his wide bulk, and then the bomb hit, and her feet were blown out from under her. There was a sudden, jagged, horizontal silver hailstorm as the windows of the shop blew out, followed by the shop's contents. Books spilled across the pavement, and a snowstorm of pages from volumes shredded by the explosion swirled around them. After a second the friar straightened, and they crossed the pavement, battling the airborne page storm out of their way. The mirrors were gone. "Those are our way out," said Edie. "What do we do now?" He looked at her. "Can you run?" She looked up at his great bellied bulk standing over her. "Can you?" The ghost of a smile flickered across his flame-lit face. "Lady, when my survival depends on it, I can practically fly." He hoiked up his cassock, grabbed her hand, and ran. And she ran alongside him, matching his every long pace with 2 of her own. That headlong dash through the firestorm and the falling bombs happened so fast that later she couldn't remember the exact details. There was one point where she remembered running past a London bus on its side, and she remembered dodging through an old churchyard that appeared out of nowhere in the warren of streets. As they left, a bomb fell behind them, and she heard the friar saying, "They'll be burying those poor souls again in the morning." And then they were running on, through strangely empty and quiet streets one minute, and then through flaming ruins the next. It was only when she saw a street sign hanging off the corner of a building, reading Puddle Dock, that she realized where they were running to. The friar pushed open the door, and they tumbled in. He yanked her forward between the 2 mirrored arches. Panting, he said, "Right, home, James." And they were falling back into the mirror. She staggered, and found she had different carpet under her feet. "I think," said the friar, "that explains the mirrors." "Yeah," said Edie, trying to stop her legs from trembling. "Got the mirror thing." And then she sat down suddenly, right there on the floor, because something had to give, and her shaking legs got there first. Grasped in Spout's talons, George was being flown over the Euston Road towards the lavishly ornamented roofscape of St. Pancras Station. Spout had rescued him, but he was pretty certain Spout hadn't suddenly changed from an enemy into a friend. Spout must have taken him back for his own reasons, but why? It was still raining as they flew up and round the tall illuminated clock tower on the eastern end of the building. The long engine shed of King's Cross passed on his right shoulder, and then Spout was flapping down the roof of St. Pancras towards one of the towers that embellished the structure. As it loomed ahead of them, Spout spread his wings wide, slowing their speed to a stalling point. Just when it seemed they were going to start falling, he reached out a talon, stuck to the corner of the wall, and then he put George down in the narrow space behind him. There was no question of George getting away. They were in a small area where 3 angles of roof met, and then fell away sheer. A lead gutter box provided a place for George to squat, while he watched the gargoyle settling into position, except that unlike the other gargoyles that George could now uncomfortably see dotted all over the building, who were all facing out at the city, Spout turned and looked in at George. George had no clue as to what was going to happen next. The gargoyle stared at him, and then slowly stretched its wings, shook itself like a dog, and folded them neatly back down round his back. It was the first time George had really had a chance to look at Spout properly, at rest.
Back,
Rasped the creature. Yes, said George. Nice place you got here.
Gawk,
Said Spout, leaning in and tapping his own mouth, then prodding George back against the tiles.
Gawk.
He was definitely trying to communicate, and he looked irritated at George's inability to understand what he was trying to say.
Gawk.
Sorry, said George. I don't speak gargoyle. Spout shook his head and battered at his mouth again, wingtips clattering against the bad fangs. And George suddenly realized what he must be saying.
Gawk.
Spout. You want the spout I pulled out of your mouth? Yes, of course. I'm sorry. Now it all made complete sense. It explained why the creature was so tenacious in its pursuit of him. He'd wrenched an important part out of his mouth, and the gargoyle wanted it back. He scrabbled in his trouser pocket, and eventually managed to disentangle the metal pipe. He held it out like a peace offering, and then he got clever, just in time, and snatched it back out of Spout's grasp. Perhaps we can make a deal. You put me down on the ground, and then I give you your spout back. Understand? He mimed flying down, then handing over. Spout cocked his head. And then his talon flashed out and back, with surprising speed, and George's hand was suddenly empty. The gargoyle looked at the metal pipe it now held in its own grasp. Yeah, said George. Or you could take it now, and then put me back on the ground. I'm easy. Spout looked at George with a stony intensity. He twirled the pipe once in his talon, and then tossed it over his shoulder. George stared at him, as they listened to the pipe ping and clatter its way down the roof and onto the engine shed below. George swallowed.
Gawk.
Spout clattered his wingtip against his chest, and then poked George insistently.
Gawk. Eigengang. Eigengang. Gawk.
Sorry, I don't know what Eigengang means. Spout lunged forward and grabbed the broken lump of stone in the gutter box under George's feet and tugged it out. George tipped backwards, and his hands flailed against the tiles to stop himself falling into the void below. When he looked up, Spout was waving the broken piece of stonework at him. Suddenly George realized that this was a piece broken from the gargoyle's wing. Oh, he said. Spout squatted back in front of him and angled the broken wing knuckle towards George. You want me to mend you? He put the broken piece on the wing. It fitted perfectly.
Eigengang,
said Spout, nodding. If Eigengang means mend, I can't. I mean, it's not just a matter of putting it back. It's got to be fixed. His mind flashed back to the ordered mess of his father's studio. He saw his dad using 2 hands to hold a broken piece of sculpture together, a ballerina that had belonged to his mother. George had broken. They were trying to mend it before she noticed. He remembered his dad saying it wasn't just a matter of glue, that for a repair to work, he had to make a mechanical joint too, especially if you were going to put pressure on the brake. George thought of the immense pressure that Spout put on his wings every time he flapped, trying to keep his great mass airborne. It's complicated, he said. It's got to be glued or mortared or something. Then it's probably got to be screwed or pinned. I'm sorry. His hand squeezed the wing apologetically, and as it did so, he felt the stone becoming hot. Spout looked at him sharply.
Eigengang.
George squeezed again. The heat became fiercer. As he moved his hand along the seam between the 2 pieces of stone, it became hard to work out where the heat was coming from. And then he realized he wasn't feeling heat coming from the stone. He was feeling heat coming from his hand. He didn't know afterwards why his eyes closed, but he found he'd blanked out all the world and just focused on what he could feel. And his hearing seemed to dull, too, as he felt the rough surface of stone, and he felt the popping that was occurring within the crack as split granules of stone found their sundered neighbours and knitted back together under the heat coming from his hand. And then he slumped back, exhausted, panting for breath, a dull, empty feeling beneath his breastbone. Whatever he'd done, it had cost him. He was drenched in sweat and steamed slightly in the cold air, but at least it had stopped raining. Spout shook his wing as if testing it. The broken piece was solidly a part of him again. He nodded his head with enthusiasm.
I can gang.
Then Spout's eyes widened, his ears went back, and all the hackled spines on his back raised. Something was coming. After dark, the narrow streets of the city of London become quiet, almost like a ghost town. The statue of the Red Queen in her flowing cloak, flanked in her chariot by her 2 daughters, normally stood in Parliament Square. Now, alerted to the fact that a glint was in danger, she was driving her horses along the road, the ancient design of her war chariot strikingly at odds with the shiny modern buildings towering over her. Her daughters scoured each side street as they passed, looking for Edie or anything that might give a clue as to where she was. Suddenly the Queen reined in the horses. They'd all heard it, the noise of other hooves, coming closer. As the Queen gripped her spear, the source of the sound came slowly round the corner. It was the last knight. He rode at a funereal walk, his lance lowered in mourning, his head bent forward in sadness, and across the saddle in front of him was draped the limp golden body of Ariel. When it became apparent he was going to pass by without acknowledging them, the Queen spoke. "Sir Knight, a word, if you please." He stopped the horse. The Queen looked at the golden girl lying across the horse's neck. "What is this?" The knight slowly looked at her.
"An accident."
"And what are you doing with her?" He nodded ahead.
"I'd thought to scale the building and put her on her plinth before turn of day. I would not have her die on my account."
The Queen nodded at her daughters. One came round to the side of the knight's horse and pulled Ariel off and onto her shoulders.
"Go back to your guild, knight," said the Queen. "We will take care of her from here.
She will be on her plinth by turn of day." The knight bowed his head, backed his horse into a turn, and rode slowly away. High on the roof of St. Pancras, George could hear them coming. In the middle of everything, he had forgotten what the gunner had told him about gargoyles, that they might be taints and bent on his destruction, but that they always had to answer their first purpose, which was to be highly decorated waterspouts. This meant that when it rained, they had to go back to their places on whatever roof they came from and funnel water, except for Spout, who'd been able to fly freely through the rainstorm. George had a strong feeling that he'd somehow changed the gargoyle by giving it a name and ripping out the metal pipe that had gagged it. But now it had stopped raining, and looking over the edge of his precarious perch, George saw that a great many stone things were crawling towards him. Most of the St. Pancras gargoyles had come alive and were converging on them. The larger ones dragged their wings after them like great capes, while the smaller ones hopped from perch to perch, leapfrogging each other as they came. Spout turned to him and held out a talon.
"Gang,"
he said.
"Gang here."
At that moment something tumbled out of the sky above them and buried its teeth in Spout's shoulder. The momentum knocked him off his perch, and George's eye met his for one appalled moment. Then Spout and the smaller gargoyle who dived on him from the spire above fell over the edge and out of sight. George scrambled to the lip and looked over, just in time to see Spout and his attacker crash down on the flat roof below, landing on another gargoyle who instantly joined the fight. Spout slammed himself back into a chimney stack, stunning the small gargoyle on his shoulders. It fell to the ground, and Spout savagely back-heeled it over the edge. The gargoyle that was locked onto Spout's front tried to get its fangs into his throat, but the lopsided gargoyle struck faster. The surrounding creatures hissed in fury as Spout shook the smaller gargoyle back and forth in his jaws, and he spat the lifeless creature onto the tiles. 3 big gargoyles rushed Spout. He kicked the first out of his way, but the other 2 tackled him, and all 3 disappeared in the darker air over the engine shed. Staring down, George was wondering what to do when a gargoyle grabbed him from the side. He snatched up a piece of stone and crunched it into the gargoyle's face. There was a thunk, and the head dropped off the body. The gargoyles around on the roof were suddenly very still. Then they began to hiss, and slowly closed in. George was outnumbered. His only hope, he realized, was the light beaming straight up from the roof about 20 meters away. It was a skylight, and though jumping through a window is not usually advisable, in this situation he thought it might be the safest option. If he could get inside the building, there would be corridors and rooms and places to hide. If he was going to have any chance of getting off this roof, he would have to do it now, before the gargoyle horde closed in any further. So he gripped his piece of stone and ran towards the rectangular skylight. A big gargoyle launched into the air on the other side of the glass as George leapt high. He registered that all there was beneath the glass was a drop the height of one room onto a pile of old boxes. Bringing his feet together in mid-air, he slammed his heels down on the glass in one mighty smash. One thing about London is that the people in charge of how things are built have very strict rules about materials that have to be used. One of the rules about skylights is they have to be made from tough safety glass. George's heels smashed down on the glass and didn't break anything, except his fall. The water, lying on the rain-slick surface, did, however, combine with his considerable forward momentum and turned the glass rectangle into a skating rink. George's feet flew out from under him. He slid beneath the airborne gargoyle and tobogganed at high speed towards the edge of a very steep roof and a long drop onto the engine shed below. A second later, he flew off the roof and plunged into the void. CD 3. Edie had got her legs back under control, but she was still sitting on the pub floor, absorbing what had happened to her. Finding herself in the midst of World War II, at the height of the Blitz, had been quite different from the sharp pain of merely seeing slices of the past when she touched a charged piece of stonework or metal. The friar watched her from the bar, which he leant against, still getting his breath back. "And the second question?" he said. "Second question?" she asked. "Apart from the mirrors and how they work, you said you had a second question." Though it had only been minutes ago, it felt like she'd asked that question in a different life. "Yeah, right. The hard way. You said if George didn't make his sacrifice by putting the broken head on a stone, then he'd have to do things the hard way. What exactly is the hard way?" To her surprise, he told her. He explained that George must stand and fight 3 duels, and that they had all to be fought above or below ground, in the air or on water. And he explained that this was so because the challenger of the 3 contests was one of London's forgotten rituals, part of the living warp and weft of the city. "He has to fight 3 duels," said the friar, "to earn his place in the fabric." "Well, what if he doesn't fight?" "He has to. To refuse a contest is failure. To fail is to become a stone servant and walk in thrall to the power in the stone for eternity." "But if he doesn't know this, he might refuse the challenge. I would. I'd run away unless I couldn't avoid it." "Then you'd better find him and tell him, had you not?" "But how can I find him?" "Look for him." "In this city, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack." "Then don't waste time." He jerked his thumb towards the door behind him. "Be on your way. The first step in finding a needle in a haystack is to start." She sat tight. "Will you help me find George?" The friar scooped George's coat off the counter and then let it fall with a distinct and giveaway thunk. Little Tragedy scuttled out of the shadows, and Nimble fingered his way into the pocket. In an instant he pulled out the broken dragon's head. The friar snatched the carving from his hands. "It appears the boy didn't trust me," said the friar, "and neither did you. And trust, milady, is a 2-way street, and that street is now closed. I cannot abide a liar." As he glared at her, there was a tap at the window. She followed his gaze. 3 figures were outlined against the night beyond. 2 of them had noses pressed to the frosted glass, so close that it was clear their eyes were black raven eyes. The figure behind them was less distinct, but he was tall and seemed to be wearing a hood. The friar put the dragon's head back in the pocket of George's coat and then walked to the door. "Keep her out of sight until I tell you," he hissed over his shoulder. Edie felt Tragedy tugging at her urgently. "Come on, Glitney, time to be somewhere else." She let him pull her back into the shadows behind the arch. They could see the bulk of the friar blocking the door as he opened it, and then he stood in it, like a roadblock, whispering earnestly to whoever was on the outside. Edie's blood ran cold. She believed the figure outside was the walker, the man who'd sent the Minotaur after her, who'd calmly threatened to slit her belly and spill her guts onto the floor. If it was the man she'd glinted and seen drowning the girl in the ice hole at the Frost Fair, then her blood had every reason to turn cold in her veins. Because if it was him, then death had come to call. When George had slid pell-mell across the wet skylight and been launched into the void above the glass-roofed engine shed far below, there was an instant of weightlessness before gravity took over. George had heard that people who fall off high buildings lose consciousness before they hit the pavement. George had always wondered how anyone knew this stuff. It wasn't as if you could ask dead people how it had felt. He fell through the air like a flailing starfish, watching the humped glass roof of the train shed coming up to meet him with an appalling finality. Only it didn't. A ton or so of flying sandstone swooped in at a shallow angle and caught him, flattening off his downbound trajectory and slowing his velocity. George had the air knocked out of him as the gargoyle almost fumbled the catch, but then he saw the wing that was flapping above him, and he saw the mended seam, and twisted his head to see the gargoyle's face. The face spared him a quick look and said, "Gah!" "Hello, Spout," said George. "We got to stop meeting like this." Spout swerved suddenly. A large gargoyle swiped a talon at them, and then a second one flew at them from above. Spout only managed to avoid a collision by flying into the side of the building and bracing himself against the scaffolding. As George grabbed onto the plastic safety webbing, Spout punched away another assailant with a snarl, and then turned and lashed a hole in the webbing. Before he could quite realize what was happening, Spout had grabbed him and pushed him into the relative safety of the decking within. He sprawled on the splintery boards, and then turned in time to see Spout's great stone mouth produce the first clear word George had heard from it. "Go!" "You're saying go?" Spout nodded fiercely, one eye scanning the sky above him. "Go! Eigengang! Go!" And George got it. "Eigengang! You're trying to say Iron Hand! You're calling me Iron Hand!" Spout rolled his eyes, and then was savagely yanked back into the blackness as the gargoyle dropped on him and tackled him round the neck. Now gargoyles were buffeting the protective mesh round the scaffolding. George ran along the clanking aerial walkway, trying each window as he passed. 4 windows along, he got lucky. The glass was being replaced, so there was just a dark hole in the brickwork. He vaulted in and rushed blindly through a dark room full of timber and workbenches. He saw a door at the far end, which he ran for. He pushed through into a long dark corridor and stumbled abruptly, his foot, the one without a shoe on it, finding a step where the floor should be. He looked down, and in the murk realized he'd gone through the floor. He got up and made his way forward, hoping he was going to find a staircase soon. He thought he could hear stone wings and talons keeping pace with him on the scaffolding that ran parallel with the corridor, one short room away. He bumped against a bench, and something heavy thudded onto the floor. It was a club hammer. He picked it up. Having 3 pounds of drop-forged steel on the end of a stout hickory handle was just the confidence booster he needed. A thong was threaded through the handle, and he put it round his wrist. Pushing through a curtain of plastic sheeting, he found himself in a long room full of builder's equipment. George closed the door behind him, and since there was a bolt on his side of it, he locked it for good measure. The room had windows on both sides, most of them boarded up. He moved slowly round the edge of the room, and since he couldn't hear any more noise from the gargoyles outside, wondered if he was safe. He came to a line of white hard hats and overalls hanging on the wall. Dry clothes. He quickly rummaged through and found 2 donkey jackets and a padded shirt jacket. He stripped off his wet shirt and shrugged into the padded one. Then he put the smaller of the donkey jackets on top of it. It was rough, dark wool, but it was warm. He stumbled over something and was pleased to see it was a pair of workman's boots, the kind that were like leather Wellingtons without laces. He jammed his bare foot inside, then decided he'd take off his one shoe and wear both boots. He stuck his shoe down the back of his belt. A gust of wind blew in cold from the window space next to the one he was looking out of, and a rattle of chains alerted him to the fact that it was somehow accessible to the night air. He hurried over and found it was open but blocked by the huge circular mouth of a rubbish chute. He stuck his head out of the small triangular gap at the side of the chute to see if the angle was shallow enough to use it as an escape slide. The bad news was that it wasn't. The worse news was that something hissed on the wall to his right, and he looked up to see 3 gargoyles flattened on the exterior of the building, like geckos, all staring at him. He ducked away, but not fast enough to miss seeing that the outside of the building swarmed with stone creatures. He ran back to the door and tugged at the deadbolt. It was stuck, and wouldn't budge no matter how hard he pulled. Then something hit the other side of the door. That freed the bolt, and the door flew open, sending him flying backwards. 2 stone talons appeared on either side of the door jamb, and then, as he scrambled onto his feet, a gargoyle head that had once had 2 horns, but now only had 1 and a stump, snarled into the space between them. The gargoyle was too big to get into the room without ducking and edging in sideways, and that was what saved George. His hand closed on the wire handle of a paint can, and as the gargoyle started unfolding one wing into the room, George lunged forward, swinging it. It caught the gargoyle right under the chin, and the gargoyle went cartwheeling backwards out into the corridor and ended up flat on its back, stunned. As it shook its head and raised it, George went after the creature. He swung the can and hit it hard on the side of the head, and then he caught it on the backswing. The can burst as the gargoyle's head bounced back onto the floor and sprayed red paint all over its face and wing. George backed up fast, rebolting the door behind him. And now something started rattling the boarded-up windows. His legs were shaking with the frustration of having nowhere to go. To stop his legs shake, as much as anything else, he kicked out and connected with a soft roll of roof insulation. It thudded across the room, and as it did so, he knew what he was going to do. He picked up the nearest roll, staggered across the room with it, and threw it down the chute. It just fitted, with about 10 centimetres on either side. He turned and grabbed another, threw it after the first, and then went for another one, working fast and methodically. There was an alarming splintering noise from the blocked window behind him, and he saw that the creature on the other side had managed to get one corner of the boarding free. It was definitely time to leave. He took a deep breath and swung one leg into the chute. And then a thought struck him. If he reached the ground in enough of one piece to walk away, how exactly was he going to do that? The gargoyles on the outside wall would recognize him and swoop down on him. He swung his leg back out and ran across to the hooks where he'd found his jacket. He quickly jammed a second donkey jacket over the one he was already wearing. It was a tight fit, but now he felt bigger and fatly padded. Then he pulled a hard hat onto his head, snatched up a pair of heavy-duty gloves from the table, and rammed his hands into them as he ran back to the chute. Grabbing the hammer and another roll of insulating felt as he passed, he tossed the roll down the chute and swung straight after it, into the yawning plastic gullet, and then he was plunging groundwards at speed. He hit the bottom with a slamming jolt that knocked out all the air left in him. He stayed very still for a while, surrounded by the soft pink plug of roofing felt that had cushioned his fall. Then, gripping the hammer, he squeezed himself down through the roofing felt and into the half-empty skip beyond. It was covered with a tarpaulin and tied down against the wind, but he found a gap and risked a glance upwards. He saw that all the gargoyles were massed around the windows of the room he'd just left, 5 stories above. He darted into the protection given by the overhanging scaffolding and walked as quickly as he could manage towards the corner of the building. His ears strained for the sound of anything whistling in out of the sky behind him, but by the time he'd walked halfway past the next building, he thought he might have got away with it. He hurried on down the Euston Road, but he didn't notice a huge statue turn its head and look at him from a vantage point set back in the piazza outside the British Library. The huge male figure was bent over a large pair of dividers, as if measuring the world. The giant looked after him, then up at the rookery on St. Pancras, and he put his fingers in his mouth and whistled.
"Come on, Clinty, time to be somewhere else,"
said Little Tragedy, tugging Edie back through the mirrored arches, back into the dark alcove beyond. At the front door of the pub, she could see the friar talking earnestly to whoever was on the other side, but looking round she realised that there was no door out of this cloistered space. Little Tragedy put his finger up to his lips, and then Monkey swung up on one of the wall lamps and did something to the mosaic roundel in the ceiling. Then he dropped to the ground, nimble as a cat.
"Trust me, I know somewhere the tallyman won't find you."
He beckoned her to the parallel mirrors.
"It's all right. I changed the what's it in the ceiling. We ain't going in the past, just somewhere in the city they can't find you."
The friar raised his voice in the doorway, and she heard the words, "Walker!" and "Stone!" She nodded at Little Tragedy, and then her eyes were caught by George's jacket. He nodded.
"Yeah, I don't want to forget the dainty, do you?"
He nipped out into the barroom and, quick as thought, snatched the coat and was back at her side. Tugging her arm, he pushed into the mirror. She stepped in after him, feeling the surface tension stretch and pop as before. Then she was in an empty grey room, bare walls meeting dusty grey floorboards. The only relief was the criss-cross shadow thrown across the floor by the lattice window in the moonlight. The place was so silent she could hear her heart beginning to slow down. It's cold," she said.
"Well, sometimes it's cold,"
said the boy.
"Sometimes it isn't. It's a funny old room."
He was looking at her over the top of George's jacket. There was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. He still had the cocky urchin's grin, but his eyes were saying something completely different. They were saying sorry.
He's not a bad man. He's always looking after Glints. He told me. He said, no one looks after them better."
Her heart froze, and her hand was already in her pocket, closing round the well-worn disc of her sea glass. and even as she pulled it out into the grey room, she knew what she would see, because it was already hot to the touch, already blazing with warning light. And as the light shone out and cast her finger shadows on the grey walls, she completed, too late, the thought she'd begun in the pub, just before little tragedy had pulled her into the mirror. If the friar had shielded her from a bomb blast, why wouldn't he save her from the walker? Which raised the question of why the boy imp had pulled her into the mirror behind the monk's back. His eyes swivelled anywhere but at the shock and rising horror in her face. He held out the jacket.
"Here, take your coat. It's parky in here."
She looked at the mirror behind him, calculating how she could get to it without him stopping her.
"Thanks,"
she said, taking the jacket. And then she realized the heavy weight wasn't in the pocket. She looked up and saw it. Little Tragedy had the broken carving in his hand, and he backed up to the mirror in 2 fast steps. As Edie looked round at the bare grey walls, she saw something moving slowly beyond the windows. A new terror gripped her.
"Don't leave me here." "He's not a bad man," insisted the urchin. "He told me."
He put one leg into the mirror.
"Tragedy, no, please."
He shook his head. Something glinted in his eye.
"He'll be along in a while. You'll be hunky-dory. No bother."
As she leapt for him, trying to get in the mirror, he jumped back and out of the room, and she hit nothing but hard, cold glass. She stepped back, trying to clear her head, trying to think. There was a door, 4 walls, and a window. The door was the obvious choice, but for some reason she didn't want to open it or even touch it. She crossed to the window. It was, of course, barred. What she'd seen moving was still moving. It was snow. And the rooftops it was falling on all around her weren't the rooftops of the London she had just left. There were no sodium streetlights, no TV aerials, no satellite dishes. There was no traffic noise, no cars or buses. There was a distant sound of a barrel organ and the jingle of harness. Looking down through the bars, she saw a horse pulling an old-fashioned hackney cab, its wheels slowly cutting a twin furrow through the deep snow of the street. The driver sat on his high seat, a short top hat tied down to his head with a muffler, his legs swathed in a horse blanket. And then he was gone, leaving nothing but the twin wheel marks in the snow. And she knew that the imp had lied about this being a safe house. She could always tell if stones held sadness or anguish or horror, and this was why she didn't want to touch the door handle a couple of meters away across the floorboards. She knew all this even without hearing the distant sound of sobbing that came from a lower floor. This was no safe house. This was the house of the lost. George had just heard an ear-splitting whistle behind him, and he felt he'd better get as far from it as he could. But as he hurried west on the Euston Road, there was a sudden hiss. He looked up, and there were 2 massive stone bat-wings blocking his way, as the gargoyle he'd hit with the red paint can dropped softly onto the pavement in front of him. The red was splashed across it like blood, and its head was cocked, the one paint-spattered eye screwed shut, while the other seemed to bore into him. With nowhere to run, George knew that his battle was about to be here and now. He knew it from the twinge in his arm, from the dragon's scar, and the 3 flaws entwining his forearm. The gargoyle scraped one talon forward on the paving stone, and then dragged the other one after it. As George gripped the hammer, ready to go down fighting, his hand twinged again. He held it out. "Back off," he said. Amazingly, the big taint stopped. Seeing his wrist extending from the donkey jacket sleeve, George caught a glint of metal reflecting the streetlights on a part of him where he should have just seen skin. He decided he didn't have the time to worry about that now. He had to keep his advantage over the gargoyle. "A maker's mark," he said. "An iron hand. You back off, or I'll—" He was thinking of what to say next when a voice came from behind him. "Most likely bleed all over him, like." A Geordie from north-east England. "Oh, was you, bunny lad? I'd lower the hammer and step backwards." George wanted to look behind him, but he didn't want to take his eyes off the gargoyle. Another voice, South London this time.
"Big Red there's not fussed about your hand, Sonny Jim. He's fussed about 4 Lee Enfields pointing right at his ugly mug."
And a third, from the West Country.
"Now, why don't he step back to us, lad? Be safer, all things considered."
George turned. 4 bronze World War I soldiers were behind him, tall men in long flapping army greatcoats, and they all held rifles levelled unwaveringly at the gargoyle. George backed up fast. 3 of the soldiers made a space for him without taking their guns off the taint, while the 4th took a step forward and prodded it in the chest with his gun. The gargoyle flinched, hissed, and then threw itself into the air, its great wings beating as it pulled itself higher and higher until it disappeared behind the rooftops. There was a general easing of tension and uncocking of guns, and then the soldiers crowded round George.
"You'll be the boy we heard about, moose-like," said the one called Westy. "Has got a pigeon telling us to keep a sharp eye out. Friend of the gunners, it said."
George nodded. Another looked round.
"Said that was with the last two, kidder."
"Edie," said George. "We got split up." The soldiers tutted. "Who are you?" said George. The soldier nearest him, the Londoner, said, "Rifleman South." He thumbed introductions over his shoulder without looking. "These are my oppos. Corporal North's a Geordie bastard, as you can tell, so he don't understand hardly nothing what he says. Westy here's a bit of a wurzel, and Private East there, well, he don't say much. He lets his fighting do the talking. We're all good men in a scrap, none better. They call us the Euston Mob." He jerked his thumb at the obelisk with 4 empty plinths at its base. "That's where we stay. We was railwaymen, see, before the war, so they put us in front of Euston Station. Plinths on points to the compass, as you see, hence the names. Come on, out of the street." He led George back towards the obelisk. The soldiers sat down against the monument's base, except for East, who kept watch on the sky towards St. Pancras. "The gunner's in trouble," said George. "I need help." "All right, Sonny Jim," said South. "Why don't you start by telling us what's going on?" And, in as few words as he could manage, George sketched everything that had happened to him since his nightmare began. "So anyway," he finished, "I started out to help the gunner, and now I've got these 3 contests to fight as well." "Oh, yeah," said South. "You've got to fight them. Duck 'em and you're done. Them stripes on your arm, they're the marks of your task. Each stripe is different, see, like the contests are, and they're on the move, right?" George stared at the floors, corkscrewing towards his elbow. 2 was slowly moving up his arm, but the metal one had just started to circle it in a tight coil. As if it couldn't go further. He nodded.
"It'd be worse than the Black Dam," said Westy. "If you let one of they buggers get to your heart, you'll likely croak. Or worse."
Now George was panicking. "Wait, but with the knight, I didn't finish the fight. I mean, am I already doomed?"
"No, you didn't run," said South. "You was grabbed and taken away by this gargoyle called Spout. Or, in worst you could say, his rain-stop play. It wasn't your idea. Your first duel ain't over, it just got cut short. I'd say you're half a scrap down and 2 more to go. Look at how that metal vein must have started to move, but then stopped. If you'd chosen to run away, it would have continued on and split your heart. It's just coiling round and round, like it's marking time, till you meet the knight again, and finish the duel you started. But that ain't the problem right now." He took out his pocket watch and tapped it. "This is." George stared at the timepiece. If he'd felt sick before, he felt sicker now. "You're saying the gunner's out of time. It's nearly turn of day."
"Aye, lad, exactly," said North. "And if his plinth is empty by midnight—"
"The gunner's at it," finished South. "But I'm out of time," said George. "I'll never—" "You want to talk, lass," said East, "and listen more. What did he say?"
George reran the conversation in his head. "If his plinth is empty by midnight—" They were all looking at him, and then he got it.
"You mean if someone takes his place on the plinth? He won't die?"
4 bronze faces nodded solemnly at him.
"Well, that's easy. I'll do it." "It's not just standing there, Sonny Jim. There's other things to be dealt with, see? Something."
He broke off and looked at his watch.
"No, God blimey, never mind that. Question is, how fast can you run?"
George didn't waste any time answering. He just nodded and sprinted westwards. He was running so fast he didn't see the homeless man in the doorway track him with raven black eyes.
"Boymaker, running west, down Euston Road."
Edie stood still for a long time. After the distant fit of sobbing, the house was silent, and she stood in the middle of the room, as far from the walls as she could get. Being a glint, she noticed a horrid metallic attraction from the walls, enticing her to touch them and release the stored trauma. It was the same intensity of sadness she felt as she passed churchyards and old hospitals. She tried to keep her mind off the tug of the stored distress by calmly checking the room for anything that might help her. There really wasn't much to see. The barred window, the 2 mirrors, and a thick layer of dust over everything. Edie turned her attention to the floor. Now she focused on it, she realized that the thick tug of pent-up anguish that came at her from the walls also dragged at her from below. She had never been in a place that held so much potential malice and sadness stored in it. The floor was thick with dust, but there were distinct footmarks, which she could see were hers, and the bare feet of little Tragedy. There were also paw marks that had nothing to do with either of them. They were like dog paws, but bigger than any Edie had seen, and then there was a swirling drag mark serpentining into the room from the door. It came about a third of the way inside, and then stopped. Edie was standing there, trying to piece together the evidence in front of her eyes, when she became aware of a tickle in her nose. Stirred up by the dust, a sneeze was on the way. She grabbed her nose and jammed George's balled-up jacket over her face to muffle the sound, but it exploded out of the side of her mouth. For a moment she thought she got away with it, but then she heard the unmistakable noise of someone coming upstairs. She could hear a dragging sound, too, a sort of rustling, and the counterpoint of smaller clicking footsteps alongside the noise made by the bigger thing. A golden strip of wavering light appeared in the crack beneath the door, and then the footsteps and the scuffling stopped. As Edie quietly slipped her arms into George's coat, she heard hungry intakes of breath from whatever was outside. Looking down, she saw the warning stone blazing a shaft of light out of her pocket, and she closed her hands round it, extracting some faint support from the familiar sea-rounded edges and accompanying heat. The door opened. In the opening stood a tall woman in an old-fashioned grey dress, whose skirts bellied out and trailed on the ground around her. Her hands were covered by thick protective gloves made from rough suede that reached up to her elbows like gauntlets. Edie couldn't see her face because she held a candle high in front of it.
"What is your name?"
said the woman.
"What's yours?"
said Edie. There was a pause.
"You are a young girl."
Yeah. What are you, blind?"
The candle lowered as the woman answered.
"No, I'm not blind, child. I just choose not to see."
It was the word choose that made what Edie saw so much more disturbing. The woman's face was gaunt and almost ageless in its severity, but the most striking thing was the eyes above her high cheekbones. Her eyelids were sewn shut with thick black cobbler's thread.
"Why would you do that?" said Edie. 8 short stitches. It's nothing, child. Not if you wish to stop seeing." "But why?" "Come. You know why. You know what happens when we do what we do. You know, willpower is not enough to keep our eyes closed. And then they see what is stored in the stones. And you know that the shards of the past stored in the stones are almost always terrible." "You said we. You mean you're a glint?" "I was. And it is my lot to live in this house. Can you feel what is in this house?"
Edie nodded, her mouth too dry to answer. Then she realized the woman couldn't see her, but before she could say anything, the woman was speaking again.
"Of course you can. You do the same to yourself, girl. Close your eyes, wear thick gloves and sturdy boots to avoid any contact with a building whose every touch invites an agony 100 times worse than a mere needle prick. Now, enough talk. You must come with me."
Edie had a very strong sense that she was being taken somewhere worse than this. And even though they hadn't worked, she wanted to stay close to the mirrors and the door they might open back into her normal world and time.
"Forget it," she said. "No way." "You must do as I say, girl. You must not say no.
Watch me." There was a low growl as the blind woman's skirts billowed out on each side, and 2 huge mastiff dogs came into the room, heads low to the ground, ears flattened, teeth bared, double-spiked collars gleaming sharply in the moonlight, hunched and ready to spring.
"You can come now,"
said the blind woman.
"Or you can beg to come later."
The dogs prowled forward, eyes rolled up and fixed on Edie. The spittle leaking from their snarls left a trail in the dust as they moved across it.
"Look,"
she said, and the dogs leapt at her, teeth clashing, loud, angry barks hitting her with the force of actual blows. Dog spittle ribboned across her eyes as a hand snapped up to protect her face from the sharp fangs clashing millimeters away from it. Pushed back to the wall by the enraged barking and snapping teeth, Edie touched it by mistake and began glinting in harsh, jagged slices. The room, in summer, sunlight shafting through the window. A short-haired woman in a light blue sundress crouched in the centre of the room. Time sliced, and the woman was suddenly shouting "No!" at the door. Another slice, and Edie saw her hand scrabbling something hanging on a chain round her neck to protect it from whoever was standing in the door. Clutching it tight, almost hiding the telltale light blazing out from its sea-rounded edges. It was a brown piece of sea glass, a heartstone. Edie saw the short-haired woman go very still, and then she saw two huge mastiffs leap into the frame, barking furiously, and she heard a scream. Time sliced, and on the floor where the woman had been was nothing except her sea glass in the dust. Edie jerked her hand away from the wall, and the glinting stopped abruptly. "Whatever you saw, child," whispered the blind woman, "it will be worse when it happens to you." Edie decided to live, to fight another day. "Fine," she said. "Fine." She reached into her pocket and folded her hand round her heartstone before stepping carefully past the dogs towards the blind woman. The dogs moved with her, growling more quietly now, eyes still locked on her. "If you do anything other than what I tell you," murmured the blind woman, "they will bite." Edie came and stood in front of her, shadowed by the dogs. She stared into the whip-stitched eyelids. The blind woman slowly pulled off a glove, and an unexpectedly soft hand traced the contours of Edie's face. "Tell me what you want," said Edie. "I want nothing that you can give me. I want my warning stone. He stole it." "The Walker," said Edie. "Who else takes our heartstones?" "Why does he do it?" "He wants the power in them, the power that makes them blaze, the power that gives us strength to cope with glinting the past. It's such a small piece of power, but it means everything to one of us. Whereas the only way he can get enough strength for his needs is to collect all our stones and add their powers together." "Why does he need this power?" said Edie. "Ask him," said the blind woman. "He's coming." For the first time in a long while, George felt he was running towards something instead of away from everything. Maybe that was why he was able to dredge up the reserves of strength he needed. He was going to be able to buy more life for the gunner if he just made the run in time. He turned into a narrow alley, and suddenly found a low sports car heading straight for him. He kept on running. Luckily, the alley was so narrow, the driver was going slowly, so when George didn't stop, he had enough time to slam on the brakes. The car came to a halt, entirely blocking the alley. George didn't miss a step. He just jumped up onto the bonnet, over the roof, and down onto the boot, and was running away into the empty alley beyond before the driver knew what was happening. Now George could see the trees of the park beckoning at the end of the road. He chicaned through the late-night traffic and slipped into the park. He saw a clock face on the side of one of the buildings on Park Lane as he passed, and as he ran past a tall modern hotel, his heart was pumping like a trip hammer. But now it was because he knew he was going to make it to the plinth before midnight. "Hang on, Edie," he thought. "I'm almost there." The blind woman led Edie down 2 flights of stairs as calmly and precisely as if she could see. One dog walked in front of Edie, the other trailed her closely, like guards. The house had no carpets, pictures, or furniture, no decorations of any kind. The woman stopped in front of a door and, taking off her gloves, felt at her waist for a large keyring that was hanging from her belt. She put the glove back on before she put the key in the lock and turned it. "Walk forward and sit on the chair." Edie heard a low growl behind her and walked through the door. There was a solidly built chair in the middle of the room, resting on small iron wheels attached to each leg. The room was lit by a single candlestick on a desk in the centre of the floor. Shelves covered every inch of wall, and on them were irregular lumps and bundles. Piles of paper covered the desk and the floor around it. Edie walked to the chair and sat in it with a shiver. The 2 dogs padded in after her and lay at her feet, eyes locked on. The blind woman stepped back from the door into the hall and sat on a high-backed chair against the wall, facing the doorway. There was something pulsing at Edie from the shelves, exerting a stronger force than the background pull of the walls. She looked at the strange assortment of indeterminate shapes lumped together all round the room. "What's on these shelves?" she asked. "Stones," said the blind woman. "He collects them, like he collects heartstones, looking for the power hidden in them, a much stronger and darker stone." "Tell me why everything is about stones." There was a long silence as the blind woman thought, and then she started to talk. "Long ago, before history began, before things had names, a darkness walked the earth, and it fed on fear, and wherever it walked it spread terror and hatred and ignorance. And there was also a light that walked the earth, spreading life. And it couldn't bear to see its children live where terror and hatred bred pain and violence amongst them like a sort of canker. So it fought the darkness, and after a great struggle, it won, and bound the darkness deep in the rocky heart of the world. It imprisoned the evil in the stone below, so that it couldn't ever walk the earth again. And time passed, and humankind, who are the sons and daughters of life, spread across the earth, and they built, and they lived, and loved, and laughed. The blind woman paused, caught out by her own words, as if she had only just remembered there were things like love and laughter outside the house of the lost. Edie waited while she took a thin breath, and then resumed. As well as building, they made things. At first the makers, the artists and sculptors, worked with wood and clay. But their children began to dream of making things that wouldn't rot or perish with time, so they began to make out of stone and tried to work metal in the fire. But making sculptures out of stone and metal was much harder than working with wood and clay. And because they knew nothing hard can happen without tears and sacrifice, they began to believe that a sacrifice must be made to the stone they wished to use to make it easier to work with. She looked blindly at Edie, as if uncertain whether to go on. Anyway, although many ages had passed since life had imprisoned the evil in the rock, there were still people who had a memory that there was some ancient power in the stone. And these women, for they were women, the memory handed from mother to daughter, had the sense of the power and the memories that lived in the rock. Women like us, said Edie. Glints. Glints, said the blind woman. But time had made them forget the power in the stone was dark. When the makers came to the glints, the women told them of the power, and the makers knew how to appease living things. They decided to make a blood sacrifice. They drew lots, and the chief maker's son lost. He was taken to a stone the glints had chosen, and a stone knife was used. Now, because these were children of life, the blood sacrifice was to be just that, not a death, just a little finger nicked with a flint knife, the tiniest of wounds, and the makers would swear an oath to the stone on the little blood that came out. And did it work? Said Edie. You know it did. The oath between maker and stone was that the stone would not resist the makers, and the makers would use the power to work stone. But the flint dagger betrayed them, perhaps because it was a blade of stone, and so had some of the pent-up evil hidden in it. So it turned in the father's hand, and the nick in the finger became a gash in the wrist, and before they could seal the wound, the child was dead. And although it was an accident, his life's blood had run into the stone, and the bond between maker and stone was sealed. He killed his own son, said Edie. The blind woman nodded. It was an accident, but time passed. The makers made. The stone didn't resist, and what they made had power. They made idols and gods and devils and gargoyles for their temples and churches, and these, though the makers didn't know it, were the first servants of the stone. They were known as taints because wherever their shadow fell, the children of light were tainted with fear. But they made the spits, too, prompted Edie. They did. Likenesses of living things, of animals and people, to represent people loved and admired, or even just the sheer joy in recording that which the makers found beautiful and pleasing. And that's why spits aren't servants of the stone. Yes, child. They were called spits because they were made as a spirit and image of real men, and so had a sort of spirit inside them that stood free of the darkness and fear in the stone. And that's why the taints, the servants of the stone, hate them, because they're free. It's more than that. It's because the spits are the maker's revenge on the stone for taking the life of the innocent child. They found a way to put a spark of life back into the world with every spit they make. She stopped. The dog's ears pricked up. And then Edie heard the floorboard creak in the hall, and a voice she had hoped never to hear again ended the story.
And in this way the battle between light and darkness, between fear and joy, continues, and the stone and the darkness pent in it always waits for the makers to tire, so that it can return to the earth and rule again."
The walker appeared in the doorway, smiling humorously at Edie.
"I do not want to hurt you. I do not, in fact, even want your warning stone. I merely want your help in one small matter. I want you to use your gift for me."
"How?" said Edie.
"I want you to test some stones for me. Just touch them and tell me what lies within. Do that, and you may go free, unharmed, and safe."
George ran through the left passage of the triple arch alongside Apsley House and onto the central island of Hyde Park Corner. Right in front of him he could see the huge stone field gun pointing to the sky, and 2 of the 4 bronze soldiers around it. He couldn't see the gunner's side, but he could see a bombardier with 2 huge shell holsters hanging on the side of each leg, and the soldier lying on a stretcher. His booted legs stuck out from the coat covering him, boots showing signs of hard wear. As George got up on the surrounding dais, he noticed the laces on one boot had obviously snapped at the bottom, had been quickly tied together in a rough and ready knot. He ran on round the dais to the gunner's side. Where the gunner usually stood was only a slab of bronze plinth, and a blank wall of smooth-cut, weather-stained stone. George looked round at the bombardier with the shell canisters on his legs.
"Excuse me," he said.
"I know about spits and taints and everything. I'm a friend of the gunner." The soldier didn't move a millimetre. George decided not to waste time. "I'm going to stand to for the gunner, on his plinth. The Euston mob told me all about it." There was still no reaction, so he clambered up onto the gunner's stand and felt the cold wall at his back. On the other side of the street a homeless man was pushing his belongings past in a tattered red tartan shopping basket. His eyes were staring blankly across the traffic. They were black eyes, with no hint of white. The traffic was too loud for George to have heard him speak, even if he'd noticed him, which he didn't.
"One boy maker, Hyde Park Corner, on the War Memorial."
George leant back and spread his arms in the way he remembered the gunner did. He trod on something and bent down and picked it up. It was a horsewhip. The gunner had obviously left it there when he had taken George under his wing. He put down the hammer and picked up the whip, feeling the solid heft of the thing in his hand. He noticed that once he took hold of it, the rigid bronze lash, casually wrapped around the haft, became flexible. It was as if the sculpted item was becoming real in his hand. He kept his feet on the plinth and shook out the lash. "The hell do you think you're doing?" The voice came from the left. George looked that way and saw the statue of the officer from the other end of the monument looking at him. He wore a tin helmet and a pair of binoculars in a case high on his chest. Below that he held his hands together with a heavy greatcoat loosely folded over them. The officer sucked his teeth in irritation. "You're the boy got the gunner driver gallivanting off his station." "That's why I'm here," said George. "He got taken by the walker. He's not going to be here by turn of day, so I'm going to take his place. Then we have another day to rescue him." "You're going to stand too? In his place?" "Yes," said George. As he said it, he felt a ripping, burning sensation on his forearm, and he doubled up, cradling the painful arm with his good one. The whip clattered to his feet. The officer dropped his coat and darted over to George. "What's wrong, boy?" "My arm," gasped George. The officer checked his watch and knelt by him. "Quickly, boy, jacket off. Show me." The officer helped George get his arm out of the double jacket he was wearing, and then rolled his shirt sleeve up to reveal the arm from shoulder to wrist. "You're a plucky one, no doubt about that. You carry the marker the hard way." George looked in horror at his arm. One of the flaws, the marble one, had suddenly lanced its way beyond his elbow and braided itself round his bicep, dangerously close to his armpit. The other 2 flaws were still twining below his elbow. The officer pulled his sleeve back down, hiding the arm. "Right, cover up, jacket on fast as you like. You're right, no question. You definitely have to stand now." George shrugged into the coats and fumbled with the buttons. "What changed your mind?" said George. The officer picked up the whip and put it in George's hand. "Because if you don't, that crack is going to continue up your arm and into your body, and when it gets to your heart, I'm very sorry to say you'll be dead." He smiled encouragingly. "It's not all gloomy. You take the gunner's place like you said you would, stand to until dawn, and then you should be right as rain." "You mean this is one of the contests? But how does just standing here at midnight—" "There's a little more to it than that, old son." He pushed George gently into place on the gunner's plinth, "What more?" he asked. "Please, what exactly happens when you stand to?" The officer gestured to the tortured relief carvings ringing the monument. "All that, I'm afraid. Carnage, slaughter, screaming fear, bloody waste of good men and horses. We stand to and relive it every night. It's who we are. It reminds us of why we're here. It's the Maker's purpose. While we're reliving it, it's real, and we don't know that it happens every night. Not even him, poor devil." He nodded at the dead soldier with the covered face at the end of the monument. Then he gave George one final firm clap on the shoulder. "Do it for yourself. Do it for the gunner. But just do it. Don't step off the blasted plinth. You'll be tempted, and if you still believe in anything, pray." "Pray?" said George, clenching the horsewhip. "Why?" The officer checked his watch and moved back towards his own plinth, scooping up his coat as he went. He smoothed it over his arm and then looked at George before disappearing round the right angle in the stone. "Because for the next hour, old son, you're going to be eye-deep in hell." The walker placed a scarf-wrapped bundle on the desk in the middle of the room and turned to smile balefully at Edie. He thunked the point of his dagger into the desktop, walked over to her, laughing quietly as he strapped her right hand to the chair arm. He took her left wrist, and just before he jerked the hand out of her pocket, she managed to drop the heartstone. He quickly tied the wrist to the arm of the chair. "At this point," he murmured, "some of you decide that kicking me would be a heroic final gesture." He reached back without looking and pulled the dagger out of the desktop. The blade flashed as he stabbed into the arm of the chair. Edie pointed with her chin at the shelves. "You want me to touch some of these stones?" "You're a bright spark," he said sarcastically, turning the wheeled chair so that it faced the desk. He walked round to the opposite side and cleared a space amid the papers to make room to unwrap his bundle. Edie watched as he carefully laid out its contents. The thick wax discs that looked to her like cheeses until she saw the arcane magical symbols that were scratched all over them and realized they were something else entirely. "These are old friends," he said without looking up, "and I've waited a long time to retrieve them. It is thanks to you and the boy I have reason to be so happily reacquainted with them." He carefully placed the thin gold disc on top of the smaller of the circular wax tablets, taking great pains to align its design with the marks scratched on the surface, and then he placed the little crystal ball at the centre of it. Edie thought it must roll off, but there was an almost inaudible snick as he let go, as if a magnet had been engaged, and it not only stayed in the dead centre of the arrangement, but rotated slowly as it did so. The walker exhaled in satisfaction, and turned his attention to the black mirror sandwiched between the two larger wax discs. He retrieved the gloves from his pockets and put them on. Then, lifting the top disc, he placed it on the edge of the desk, close to Edie. And then he picked the mirror up from the other one, holding it gingerly by the handle, and placed it on top of the one that was centimetres from her bare hands. She felt the black surface suck at her hand, so strongly that the hand began to move towards it without her thinking. When she tried to pull it back, it was with an effort that had her gritting her teeth at its intensity. The walker came round the table and pushed her closer to the edge of the desk. The blackness dragged her hand across the rough wood towards it. She dug her fingernails in, but it did no good. With a final effort, she threw her whole body weight backwards and her feet lashed out. It was no use. The black mirror seemed to exert a stronger pull in reaction. Her hand flipped back across the arm of the chair and slapped, open-palmed across the centre of the mirror, splayed like a white starfish on a plate of ink. The jolt of contact detonated through her body and out into the room. Layers of dust blew into the air all around her. As she coughed at the airborne dust, she noticed an extraordinary thing. She wasn't glinting. The past wasn't slicing into her in jagged shards of recorded pain. She was feeling absolutely nothing. The stone wasn't a recorder of past pain. Whatever it had witnessed had gone into it and out into the void beyond it, a void that Edie was touching. And touching that void was terrifying. What was at the end of her hand was a possibility of something so vastly, cosmically bad she couldn't even begin to get a head round it, and didn't want to. But she was slowly becoming aware that all round the edges of this black hole at the end of her arm there were things like shadows in the dark, shifting and peering back at her over the rim of nothingness. "Do you see the presences?" asked the walker. "No," she gasped. "But they're there." "Don't worry," he said. "They can't come here unless a gate is opened,
and for that to happen we would need another mirror to set up the reflections out of which they could step. I had the 2 mirrors once, but a meddling fool stole one. I've searched the city from top to bottom ever since. But now I have a glint and an iron hand at one and the same time, so I shall cut through the obstacle that I have been blocked by for 3 centuries, and open the gates in the mirrors in one bold slash." And with that he jerked the gold disc out from under the crystal ball, and sliced it between her hand and the black mirror. As it severed the connection between Edie and the void, she felt a savage, blunt pain, as if a limb had just been brutally chopped off. And then her hand was free, and she jerked it off the gold disc with a sob. He waved an arm at all the wrapped bundles of stone on the shelves. "I will have you touch all these pieces of black stone. I've spent a lot of time collecting them, as you can see, in the hope that one day I would be lucky enough to find a master maker and a glint who can tell me which one of these rough items most closely matches the feel of the dark mirror." It all became clear to her in one flash of understanding. "You think George can make you a new mirror?" "I know he can." She shook her head. "He won't do it for you, even if he does have the skill you think he has." "He will do it for you," said the walker. "He will do it to save you." And with a plummeting feeling inside her, she knew he was right. He roughly freed her right arm and pointed to the shelves. "I will unwrap these rocks. You will feel them. You will tell me which one feels most like this obsidian mirror. You will glint for me." "Okay," she said. It would buy her time. "I've freed your hand so you can reach all 3 levels of shelf. Do anything other than as I tell you, and I will have the blind woman set the dogs on you. Understood?" She heard the hungry snuffling of the 2 mastiffs under the door, and nodded as if beaten. He started along the shelf away from her, unwrapping package after package, revealing black stones of every shape and size. "Some of these are obsidian, some are flint. I didn't know the difference when I began my collection. Just touch the black glass." It was the word flint that told her what she was going to have to do. The strap pinning her to the arms of the seat was only about a centimetre wide. She would have to bide her time. "Go on, then," he said. She touched the nearest slab and jerked slightly as the memory in it flowed into her. She saw a weeping red-haired woman in a green coat sitting in the chair she was in, clutching a blazing heartstone. She screamed as the walker reached in and tore it out of her hand. "You've had other glints testing these rocks," said Edie. He nodded. "Ignore the memories of them. Their pain is a minor distraction. Find me the rock with the possibility of a gate in it. Try them all." "But why do you need me if you've already had others test the stones?" she asked. "Because the nature of the void in the mirror changes in time. The uncut stone that felt a match for the mirror 10 years ago won't be right now." She nodded and turned and felt the next stone, and the one after, and so began the longest hour of her life. Most of them held at least one anguish-soaked memory of an earlier glint, sometimes even more than one. She lost track of the pain and the faces in a mounting accretion of despair as she tried stone after stone. The pain went on and on, wearing different faces that all blurred together. She began to feel she was drowning in a never-ending sea of tears. She began to believe this was going to go on forever. Only the closeness of the heartstone in her pocket kept her going, because it was where she'd hidden her last hope, her one desperate plan for escape, a plan that could only happen when everyone was in the right place. And it was so unending, this onslaught of other women's despair, that when she came to the empty stone, she wept with relief. He didn't have to ask her if it was the one. He just looked up from where he'd been bent over the desk, looking at the loose papers in the candlelight, and smiled. Good. Edie leant against the shelf as he reached past her and took the slab over to the table. As soon as he walked away, her hand closed on the slab of obsidian next to the place where the empty one had been. She checked he was still moving away, and when he was at his desk, carefully putting the empty stone on the surface next to the dark mirror, she took a fast, deep breath and closed her eyes. She lifted the heavy slab and smashed it down on the one on the shelf below. She heard a sharp cracking noise and felt chips of rock fly past her face. Something stung her ear, but she ignored it and opened her eyes. Sure enough, the obsidian had shattered, leaving long, fine shards all over the shelf. "What are you doing?" shouted the walker, and the noise started the dogs on the other side of the door barking furiously. Edie didn't spare a millisecond to see if he was going to get to her before she did what she had to do.
If he was going to get to her before she did it, she'd know soon enough. Her free hand darted into the stone debris and grabbed a long, thin shard like a straight razor. It was the wrong way round, but she spun it in her hand in mid-air, so the blade edge faced out as she slashed it at her trapped wrist. The obsidian blade, sharper than the sharpest scalpel, its edge a single molecule thick, seemed to whistle as it cut through the air and hit the taut rope, severing it, almost as if it wasn't there. Without pausing, she kept the momentum of her slash going, and rolled out of the chair, spinning to her feet, and whirling the heavy wooden seat on its wheels, so that it was between her and the incoming walker. He was diving forward, and hit the solid lumber hard, knocking it off its wheels as he tangled in it and fell. Edie jumped out of the way as he and the chair crashed to the floor. The candle on the table fell over with the impact, but it didn't go out. It rolled in amongst some of the loose sheets of paper that Edie had disturbed. He managed to get one hand out and grab the edge of her jacket. His normally sneering face was crimson with rage and pain.
"You will pay, you little hellcat!"
he shouted in a voice like a thunderclap, dragging her towards him.
"You too,"
said Edie calmly, and with all the power and cold fury in her body, she slashed the obsidian razor across his face.
"And don't call me little."
She didn't wait to see why he screamed so loudly as his hands released her and flew to his eyes. She just vaulted over his hunched body, ran across the room, grabbed another big lump of stone from the nearest shelf, so heavy she could hardly lift it, and with the last of her strength hurled it through the leaded diamonds of the window. The snow billowed into the room on a gust of breeze as she jumped out into the night without a second's hesitation. The only thought she had time for as she fell through the air was that for all she knew she was going to break her neck, but anything was better than what was in that room, pulling at her from the black mirror. CD 4. George clenched the horsewhip in his hand and braced his back against the Portland stone stacked massively behind him. He had 1,000 questions he wanted to ask the officer, but before he could think which one to call out, he heard the sound of a deep, familiar bell reverberating high in the night air. It was the sound of Big Ben, marking the turn of the day. As the great bell counted out the hours, he felt himself changing. He felt his body stiffen and become more ponderous. His feet felt increasingly clumsy, and his clothes seemed to become heavier. Then he forgot all that, as he focused on what was happening to the 4-story white stucco building opposite. With each sound of the bell it was fading, and in its place was a clear sky seen through a lattice of black and white silver birch trees. He looked down, and saw the dark bronze rectangle of the plinth fade away, leaving his boots standing on a muddy crisscross of wheel tracks, punctuated by hoof marks. Except they weren't his boots. They were the gunner's boots. And they weren't bronze, they were real, leather boots, canvas puttees, leather bags and holsters. He looked down at his hands. They were flesh and blood, but not his hands. They were man's hands, strong, wide, grubby, and calloused with work. His body had fast-forwarded 15 years. He looked up, and saw that the world he had fallen into was, as advertised, eye-deep in hell. A horse's body hung upside down from a tree, its legs pointing skywards. The other trees around it looked as if they'd been hacked by some wayward giant, shattered trunks jagging up out of the earth at crazy angles. Below it, the earth itself was torn up in senseless ridges and random shell holes, strewn with barbed wire and the smashed detritus of war. The officer was standing in front of him, still carrying his greatcoat, and he too was now flesh and blood, no longer a statue. "Snap to and get those nags into cover, before that spotter plane G's Fritz into lobbing a wake-up call our way." George saw a tiny, twin-winged plane moving slowly against the light. "Sir," he heard himself say, and then he saw his hand rise to the overhang of his tin helmet in a sketchy salute. He hadn't thought of doing it, but the conscious part of him seemed like a passenger without control of the body he was in. It was the same when he reached back over his shoulder and patted the muzzle of a horse that the George part of him hadn't known was there. "Come on, then," he heard himself say. "Let's find a better hole." He turned and gathered 2 leading reins in his hand. A pair of chestnut-coloured horses stood there. Behind him he could see a pair of field guns being set up for action by teams of gunners working fast to manhandle them into position just behind the lip of a shallow ridge. George led the horses towards a dip in the landscape that had 2 walls of a ruined farmhouse at the bottom. He ducked them under a low arch, and wasn't surprised to find 2 more horses already hobbled and waiting, faces obscured by nosebags, contentedly chomping away. There was another soldier crouched by a wall, trying to get a fire going under a large blackened tea kettle. "Char'll be up in half a mo," he said. As George hobbled his horses like he'd been doing it all his life, he looked at the back of the man's head. He had dark hair, the same colour as George's, cropped short on the back and sides. When he swept his hand back through the unruly longer hair on top, George felt something tug at the pit of his stomach, at the familiarity of the gesture. Then the man stood up, stretched and turned. And George's heart stopped. Any heart would stop if it saw the impossible. Any throat would choke up so tight there was only room for one small word to escape. "Dad?" The eyes he knew so well, the eyes he'd known he'd never see again, crinkled at him, and one brow rose higher than the other in an expression he'd never forget. The soldier laughed. "Who are you calling Dad, mate? I reckon I'm younger than you." And then the ground skipped beneath his boots as the first bomb hit. The gunner was up to his neck in the water that had filled the hole he'd dug in the gravel spit. And now that he'd moved the skeleton of the girl from where it had been blocking the outflow, he was definitely feeling a small current moving past his ankles. He held his breath and submerged himself. Sure enough, water was moving through a low arch that came up to just below his knees. He closed his hands on the flaking bars that blocked it. They moved. He stood up and kicked at the ancient metalwork until he'd made a space big enough to crawl through. Then he scrambled carefully back to the top of his hole and lifted the bundle of heartstones wrapped in his cape. Reaching into the scrabble of sea glass, he picked one at random and felt for the skeleton. He found a shred of dress, tore it off, and wrapped the heartstone tightly inside it in several layers so that no light would escape if the walker was to appear. Then he reached into the skeleton and placed the parcel of cloth where he thought her small heart would once have beaten. "Sleep easy, little one," he said. "He can't hurt you any more." And then he grasped the bundle, and dropping back into the hole with a splash, ducked below the water and pushed himself into the narrow water duct. The ground jumped as the bomb hit. George was knocked to one knee. Then the horses were pulling and bucking at their restraints, and the soldier with his dad's face was running across the ruined space, swearing as he looked up into the sky. He grabbed the Lewis gun set up on a stand against the low wall, aimed it almost vertically, and started firing. George looked up and saw a yellow and black biplane turning overhead, so low that he could clearly see the goggled face of the spotter sitting behind the pilot as he leant out and dropped a bomb by hand. The tiny bomb seemed to fall straight towards him. Maybe it was the gunner's instinct driving his movements, for he found himself turning his back to the blast and protecting the horses' heads with his outstretched arms. Then the Lewis gun was suddenly silent. George looked over and saw with relief the soldier was still in one piece, just trying to snap on a new drum of ammunition. "Bloody spotter plane," he swore. "We'll be in for a pasting now." He stared after the aircraft that was already a diminishing shape, heading for the horizon, and shook his head, sick at himself for missing. It was only a few moments before a giant sledgehammer slammed into the earth, with an impact that knocked them off their feet. George waited for the pain of a gushing wound to hit him, but all that happened was that he saw his father's face looming over him. He reached a hand down, and George let himself be pulled back to his feet. Another slamming impact hit the ground, this time on the other side of the ruin. The soldier grimaced, a heartbreakingly familiar expression. "Ranging shots. Fritz has got us bloody bracketed. This is going to get hotter before he gets better." George was busy comforting his horses as a new series of explosions began. "That's our mob hitting back," shouted his father, ducking as something whirled past his head. "We'll have to see if we can't hit them before they plaster us." Boom! A shell clipped some of the remaining thatch off the top of the wall and left them ducking under a hail of dry rushes and dust. "And a happy Christmas to you too, Fritz," grinned his father. The horses were bucking and pulling at their hobbles in terror, and then there was a sharp crack and a whump and something hit nearby. Something flew past George's head, and when he looked down, he saw something smoking sticking out of the leg of one of the horses. He dropped into a crouch, fumbling at one of the bags hanging off his belt for a field dressing. "Give me a hand!" he heard himself yell. "Grab his head!" The soldier with his dad's face grasped the horse's head, trying to calm it, and George saw himself reach down and grab the red-hot shard of metal protruding from the horse. He felt his fingers burning as he gripped it and yanked it out of the shaking leg muscle. As the redness gushed from the wound, he jammed the thick pad of field dressing over it, and with his other hand he shook free the bandage and looped it round the leg, winding it tight over the dressing pad, finally tying it off securely. Good job, said the soldier. He was holding onto the bit below the horse's wildly dilated nostrils. George stood up and put his arm round the horse's neck, stroking and calming it. And suddenly there was a hole in the thunder, and they stood there on either side of the horse's neck. George saw his father's hand resting between the horse's ears, and beyond it he saw the sky, a delicate blue with an exquisite green tinge to it. It was as if the instants of silence, and the fact that death could come smashing in from the sky at any moment, was making him see everything more intensely. He suddenly knew that this was an extraordinarily precious moment. He had something to say to this soldier who was and was not his father, for this was a never-in-a-lifetime chance that he mustn't squander. He turned, his mouth opening to say it, but at that instant there was another explosion, and then the shells began dropping all around them, and the day split open, and hell blasted out in a thunderous series of hammer blows as flying shrapnel and earth and stones blew past. George never saw much of the barrage. Every time there was an explosion his head was ducked down, and when he opened his eyes all there was to see was the air full of dirt flying around. All he could do was bury his face in the horses' necks, both hands rhythmically stroking the two animals, as he heard his voice saying, "Easy now, easy." Then he heard his father's voice saying, "Good boy, you're going to be fine." And even though the soldier was saying it to calm the horse, he was gripping George's arm as he did so, and George's heart opened again, despite the cacophony all around them. He found the iron in his soul and made his shaking legs do their job. As he looked down and saw them braced and supporting him, he noticed the last bad thing. His father's boots were like his, only he'd broken a lace, and had hurriedly mended it by knotting it at the toe end. George knew what was going to happen, even as his hand clenched on his father's sleeve, and he started shouting, "No! Dad! Listen! Please! I didn't mean—" The soldier's head jerked up and met his eyes across the horse's neck. He was smiling. "It's okay." The wall came in, as if a giant had booted it down. The horses kicked sideways, and George felt the hand that had been gripping his over the injured horse's neck go limp. Then both horses tumbled over, as a gout of flame rolled over them. George never let go of the arm, even though they were suddenly enveloped in a cloud of dust and smoke that it was impossible to see through. The horses lashed about in panic. He heard their screaming neighs. With his free hand he found the hobbles and released them, and then the horses were gone. He pulled his father's limp, heavy body onto his shoulders and staggered out of the burning debris. Shouting for help, though none came, he staggered forward up the hill, the weight on his back heavier with each step. Then the wind whipped away the smoke, and the barrage stopped, and he saw the hill ahead of him and dropped to one knee at the horror it revealed. One gun was pointing crazily up to the sky, the other was just not there. In its place was a crater with a gun team splayed round the rim. There were bodies blown into the barbed wire. Something was trying to crawl out of a shell hole. And then something else clattered to his feet, and he saw it was a stretcher. He looked up and saw the officer gazing at him sadly. "Put him down, gunner," said the officer. He shook his head, despite the crushing downward force on his shoulders. "Can't carry him forever. Put him down." Again George shook his head and clenched onto the arm, all the more tightly. One of his hands twined fingers into the dead hand's fingers, and he held on for all he was worth, but there was no answering flicker of life. Then the hand seemed to grow bigger in his, and his fingers slipped out of it, and he heard the fast percussive wah-wah of a police car roaring past. The rumble of London's traffic dialed back up as the sky dimmed. His knees gave way, and he fell off the bronze plinth. He felt himself caught in two bronze arms. He hung there, looking down at the officer's boots, and then he let the blackness close over him. The gunner lay in the dark water waiting for death. The human part of him was numb with the pounding claustrophobia of the pipe. The statue part of him knew that turn of day was upon him, and that his death as a spit was coming. Death, he hoped, would be a big blank, a full stop, a balance where the absence of life and hope was counterweighed by the absence of pain and despair, where calculation ceased. Then, as the seconds ticked away, he couldn't help thinking that the whole oblivion thing was an easy way out. George and Edie would still be in danger. No, he wasn't going to go gentle into any good night. Go down fighting, he thought. So he started pushing himself further into the pipe, a savage smile on his lips. He was smiling because he was doing it just for himself. He was going to die living his last moment being exactly who he was, and not a damn thing less. It was a good plan, and in the finest tradition of all good plans, destined to fail. He didn't die, being who he was meant to be. He didn't die at all. Somehow, In the middle of kicking and pushing his way along the narrow pipe, shoving the bundle of heartstones ahead of him, he realized the day had turned, midnight passed, and he was, unexpectedly and extraordinarily, not dead. He didn't know that this was because George had stood his watch and kept his place on the plinth. He just knew that he wasn't dead, and that he was feeling stronger with every foot he moved along the narrow pipe. And then the pipe came to an abrupt end. He was reaching ahead of himself to push the bundle onwards when it met an obstruction, and all progress ceased. His hands felt the sidewalls, and there it was, a void. He wasn't at a dead end at all, but at an angle in the pipe. He squirmed his arm further into the angle, and was amazed to feel no sides at all, nothing but water. The narrow duct he was in must be a side tributary to a bigger underground stream. The underground water tank was an ancient spur of the Tyburn, diverted to provide an underground reservoir. The water he was feeling moving against his fingertips was the flow of the main channel of the stream itself. He shoved the bundle of sea glass ahead of him, wrenched away the crumbling cornerstone, and pulled himself into the wider stream. He felt the pull of water tugging at him. He could easily have gone with it, but something pulled him the other way. He took firm hold of the bundle and pushed his way against the mild current. It was a contrary thing to do, but if he wasn't going to die, he was certainly going to live his way, and that wasn't taking it easy and going with any damn flow. Edie fell one short story and was saved by the thick snow. She ran off, George's jacket flapping wildly behind her, as she tried to put as much distance as she could between her and the house of the lost. She was very conscious that her footsteps were the only ones in the virgin snow. She wasn't going to be hard to find. And then she ran out into a wider street, whose surface was churned up by the passage of carts and cabs, and she ran in the middle of the road, hoping her footprints would be hidden in the general confusion. When she saw a chance, she leapt across the strip of virgin snow and into a narrow alley, hopefully leaving no clue as to where she had left the general melee in the middle of the street. Straight across the alley was a church, and beside it a small churchyard. The high wall surrounding it was topped with ornate multi-barbed spikes that poked through the soft topping of snow like a thorn bush. There was an arched stone gateway, also topped with spikes, above a black iron gate that stood ajar. Now Edie heard the chilling noise of dogs baying behind her, coming closer. Her plan was to get through those metal gates, and for her pursuers to pass. As she approached the gate, she saw that it was decorated with stone skulls. There were 2 on each side, impaled on the savage barbs, and there were 3 in the centre of the arch. The central one wore a laurel wreath like an ancient Roman emperor. It was too late for her to stop now, because the baying was closing in, and there was nowhere else to hide. So she ducked into the gate and pushed it shut. The latch clunked too, but there was, she noted, no way to lock it. She gripped the obsidian blade and listened, ready to fight. The dogs were suddenly silent now, as she crouched in the shadows of the wall and looked at the graveyard behind her. It was a cramped space, hemmed in by the backs of houses on 2 sides, and by the square tower and side of the church on the other. There were no lights in the houses, but there was a dim flicker from within the church. She saw a narrow door in the base of the tower. Without thinking, she slipped through the close-stacked ranks of gravestones. And then she heard a voice, and froze.
What a busy night. A busy night indeed, Majesty, with the resurrection men abroad.
She realized she was hearing the skulls talking to each other on the other side of the arch. And she knew what resurrection men were. They dug up dead bodies and sold them to surgeons to cut up. One of the end skulls swiveled and looked at her.
She's listening, Majesty. Impossible, unless... Ask her. Are you a glint girl?
Said the skull that she could see. She nodded.
Oh, she says yes, Majesty.
Edie backed up into the narrow door and tried it. It was locked.
She's trying to get into the church. Will you please be quiet? She hissed, stepping round a newly opened grave. She hunkered down behind a gravestone. Please, stop talking.
No, we always have the last word, for we are death. Edie boiled over.
You're not death. You're a bunch of chattering stone skulls who can't keep their mouths shut.
There was silence, and then another voice said,
No, but I am.
It was the walker, and she could see the 2 dogs silently pawing on the other side of the gate. Only now did she remember to look down at her hand holding the heartstone. She'd been gripping it so tightly she hadn't seen the warning light blazing from it. Then something large leapt to the top of the wall and crouched there, and where the dogs were panting, the thing was breathing in short, choppy shrieks of hunger. It clapped its stubby wings together over the hunched mass of its tortuously enclosed body. It was The Icarus. All the energy seemed to drain from her as she slid down behind the grave marker, realizing that now the walker had her. She used the last piece of her energy to scrabble away the snow and mud at the foot of the gravestone she was hiding behind, and stuff her heartstone deep into the earth. Then she stood up and kicked the earth in on top of it, hoping her legs were hidden as she did so. She saw the walker come through the gate, knife in one hand, the other one covering one of his eyes. As the gunner crawled his way against the floe, he felt life returning to his body. He concentrated on what his hands were touching on the wall of the tunnel, because the texture beneath his fingertips was the one thing that did change. Some of the time it was bricks, some of the time it was long curves of stone or concrete piping. At one stage it appeared to be just clay, and he felt his fingertips leaving a groove as he squirmed forward. He'd been feeling a brick side to the tunnel for quite a long time when he felt a new texture, metal. He rapped his knuckles against it, and the answering vibration confirmed his first impression. He moved on for a few feet, and then the implication of that answering vibration hit him. A metal pipe, bedded in the clay of London, would be deadened by the surrounding earth. There would be no answering vibration. The implication was that he was in a metal pipe, and that there was air, not clay, on the other side of it. His first instinct was to hit the roof of the pipe, but his hands, under the walker's interdiction, wouldn't obey his commands. He kicked the floor of the pipe in frustration. His boots definitely set off a bigger vibration. He did it again, harder, and then he smiled. He didn't say anything about digging down, did he? He turned on his back and hacked the metal-shod heels of his ammo boots on the floor of the pipe. He kicked them down again and again, and suddenly a sharp single shock shuddered through the pipe. He stomped down one last time with all the power in his body, and his feet continued downwards, out, through the bottom of the pipe, and he was suddenly falling. The Tyburn is one of London's lost hidden rivers, but it does show itself in one place, and that's where the gunner was. It crosses over the Regent's Canal in an aqueduct disguised as a footbridge, close to London Zoo. And it was out of the bottom of that aqueduct that the gunner tumbled, in his own personal waterfall. He experienced a moment of elation as he felt the air, and then a jolt of surprise as he depth-charged into the water of the canal below. He pushed off the muddy bottom and breathed in the night air. Then he jolted the bundle of heartstones onto the towpath and pulled himself out after it. He paused only to put his helmet on, and then he picked up the bundle, vaulted a fence into Regent's Park, and started running southeast. He knew it was after turn of day and that he should be dead. If he wasn't, it meant someone had stood his watch, and he wasn't going to waste a minute getting back to Hyde Park Corner to see who it was. The Icarus stood in the middle of the dusty library, its cropped wings brushing the roof as it loomed over Edie, panting short, angry screams out of the curved hull hiding its torso and head. Edie turned her face away. "If you find it worrying," said the walker, "you shouldn't have broken the window. It would never have been able to get in here without an opening that size." Edie looked at the walker's face. There was no blood where she had slashed him, but an impossibly healed white scar cut across his face, just below one eye and ending in the other. That eye was now dead, a cloudy pinky white, with no iris or pupil to be seen. "And if you didn't want it angry with you, girl, you should never have killed its brother." "I didn't kill its brother," said Edie. "The Minotaur was its brother, for they were the creations of the same maker." Far off, in another part of the house, Edie could hear the despairing sobs of the blind woman. The walker noticed her listening. He smiled and snapped his fingers. The raven flew in the window and settled on his shoulder. "You're wondering why she is crying so heartbreakingly." Edie didn't say anything. The walker's hand traced a scar across his face. "You're wondering what I'm going to do to you, for what you have done to me." He was right, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of letting him know it. He smiled without a shred of humour and started writing on a sheet of paper. "I am doomed to walk the city until the stone releases me, and so I cannot die. I heal, as you can see, prodigiously well. But in 400 years, no one has done what you have done." He looked up from the writing and pointed to the blind, pinky-white eyeball. "Now, because of you, I must walk the world one-eyed. That is an affront that requires a magnificently well-thought-out punishment." He finished off his note, folded it, and then produced the 2 interlocked circular mirrors from his pocket. She watched as he unsnapped them, revealing a second set of mirrors clipped inside. He took one set and carefully adjusted a tiny bezel running round the edge. "That will bring them straight back to where I shall be," he said to himself. He reached over to the table. Edie saw that he had sandwiched the black mirror between the two wax discs and tied them in place. He'd also knotted a leather thong through the hole in the mirror's handle. He put the thong round his neck so the heavy package hung on his front like a giant medallion. Then he pushed it inside his sweatshirt and buttoned his coat over it. He pulled his dagger out from behind him and turned back to her. As he moved, he revealed a woman's cloak and bonnet on the desk behind him. She had seen them before. She had seen the bonnet tangle around her own face as the walker drowned it, in the open spaces of the ice-covered Thames, at the Frost Fair. "Here he comes," said the officer's voice. George swam slowly upwards out of the dark pool of sad dreams. It was a huge effort even to open his eyes. When he did, there were 2 pairs of bronze boots in front of his nose. He was lying beneath a heavy greatcoat that was somehow warm and supple as wool, despite being made of the same bronze as the boots. One pair of riding boots was the officer's. The other pair were heavier and more workmanlike, laced boots topped off by mismatched leggings, one set of puttees, the other armoured with a calf protector. George knew those boots. He scrambled to a sitting position and looked up. The gunner smiled down at him. "Hey," he said. "Hey," said George. As the gunner squatted down in front of him, eye to eye, George suddenly had to get the great thing rising in his throat out before it choked him. "I saw my dad." The gunner nodded. "Yeah, you would." After a beat, he pointed over his shoulder at the body lying at the north end of the monument. "It's him, isn't it? The unknown soldier. That's why his face was made covered, so he could be everyone's lost one. So you just made him your dad." George nodded and put on a tight smile. "Must have been rough," said the gunner, and he put his hand on George's shoulder. "I'm okay," said George. "Look at your arm," said the officer. George had forgotten about the marble groove jagging its way towards his armpit and the heart beyond. He tore at his shirt and looked. The entire floor had disappeared, leaving only a faint red mark, like a scar, well on the way to healing. "It's gone," he said. The officer smiled. "A duel is a duel, I'd say, whether it's fought with dueling pistols, rapiers, or great big hulking artillery pieces like that one." He pointed up at the huge stone gun topping the monument. "And you certainly stood your ground. I'd say that's 1 down, 2 to go." George smiled and felt the other 2 grooves still twining below his forearm, the gritty stone one and the smooth brass one. "I'd say you're right," the gunner grinned and gripped his shoulder. "And by the by, thank you." He held his big hand out. George took it. The gunner grasped it firmly. "Saved my bacon, no mistake. And if you don't mind me saying, I reckon your dad would have been proud of you." George got to his feet. "Edie," he said. "We need to find her." "No question," said the gunner. "The walker's after her, and is after you." He told George what the walker had said about the black mirror. And then George told him about everything that had happened to him. Just as he got to the bit about the Euston mob, the officer tapped the gunner on the shoulder and pointed at a dark shape gliding in from the east. The 2 soldiers unholstered their guns and aimed at the raven as it coasted in towards them. George picked up his hammer. "It's got something in its beak," said the officer. The raven landed on the white stone in front of them and gently laid the 2 mirrors on the ground. Then it stepped back. "There's a note tied on it," said the officer. "Last pair of mirrors I saw like that," said the gunner, "was in the walker's hands." George darted forward and slid the note out. It was a simple message. "Come to me, beneath the main banner at the Frost Fair. Step into the mirrors, and they will bring you. Come now, or the girl dies." The gunner and the officer read it over his shoulder. "He could be bluffing." "No," said George. "He's not bluffing." He lifted the cord that had been used to attach the note to the mirrors. It was a dark, almost aubergine colour. "It's Edie's hair." The gunner swore under his breath. Then he aimed his gun at the raven. The raven wasn't surprised. People always shot the messengers when they brought bad news. What did surprise it was that it wasn't a bullet in the chest bone that sent it to hell again. It was a spear thrown with great force and accuracy from the opposite direction. George and the gunner and the officer looked at the sudden explosion of black feathers and then across the grass to where the spear had come from. There was a parked chariot, and a very businesslike queen was striding towards them to retrieve her weapon.
"What are you men all staring at?" she said. "Sounds like we have a girl to rescue. Now, what I suggest is—"
"You don't suggest anything," said George. "If you want to help, you listen, because Edie told me about this. She glinted it." As the Spitz looked at him in surprise, the Queen swelled in indignation. "I will not," the gunner interrupted her. "Yeah, you will. If you want to help the girl, listen. The boy knows what he's talking about." So the Queen bit her lip and kept quiet, as George quickly told them how Edie had glinted the frost fair, and seen herself chased by the walker and drowned in an ice-hole. He told them every detail he could remember. "I don't know if it really was herself she saw being drowned, and if it was, I don't know if you can change the past. All I know is she saw it, and I'm going into those mirrors to do everything I can to stop it happening." There was a beat of silence. He turned and retrieved the lump hammer from where he'd lent it. The Spitz looked at each other. The Queen turned and snapped her fingers at her daughters behind her. "Girls, come and hold the mirrors. It's going to take very careful riding to get the chariot through in one piece." The walker led Edie towards the frozen Thames. She scarcely noticed anything except the snow in front of her and the strap binding her wrists together. Her vision was restricted sideways by the bonnet the walker had tied round her head. It jutted forward on either side like blinkers. Her bound hands were hidden in a muff that hung from the front of what she assumed was the blind woman's cloak. She knew what the frost fair would look like. She'd seen it all before when she'd glinted her own death. One thought kept whirring round and round in her head. You can't change the past, even if it hasn't happened yet. If she was going to escape, then she wouldn't have seen herself in the ice hole. If she couldn't stop this happening, why try to escape? On the other hand, if she didn't try to escape, how could she stop this happening? If she hadn't already glinted it, the sight that met Edie's eyes as the walker led her over a plank onto the frozen surface of the river would certainly have amazed her. Below the looming span of Blackfriars Bridge, the entire width of the Thames was iced over and covered in snow. Hundreds of lanterns and flaming torches illuminated the ramshackle street of makeshift tents and shelters that had been set up down the centre of the river. Mingled with music and laughter and the sounds of a holiday crowd enjoying itself was the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. London's tavern owners and cooks had taken to the ice, selling their wares out of temporary premises decorated with garish signs and billboards. And it wasn't only food and drink that were for sale. There were souvenir stands and portrait painters, there were jugglers and acrobats, fairground games, and a huge swingboat full of shrieking men and women of all ages. Again, if Edie hadn't already seen all this, she would have been captivated by the magic of the sight. As it was, seeing it all again, especially the monkey and the barrel organ, terrified her. She remembered how their music had been drowned by an approaching sound of bagpipes as the parade moved down the ice street, leading a white elephant that had stolen everyone's attention. And on cue, Edie heard the warning rattle of snare drums as a pipe band skirled into life in the distance. The walker was pushing her ahead of him, one hand firmly on her shoulder. She knew she needed to think fast and move before everything closed in on her. She needed to choose something, and she needed to do it now. Even if it didn't work, she'd go down fighting. The flash of a knife blade caught her attention. A cook was serving slices of beef from a joint turning on a spit in the mouth of a booth just ahead. He had stabbed the blade into the wooden carving block as he took a customer's money. She pushed the muff awkwardly up one arm. The walker shoved her forward, not noticing that she'd exposed her wrists to the cold night air. She held her breath, and then, when the knife was in reach, threw herself forward. Her hands chopped through the air on either side of the blade, slamming into the carving surface. The blade cut through the strap binding her wrists together, and as soon as she felt the constraint part, she pulled her hands back up and grabbed the handle of the knife, yanking it out of the wooden block. As the walker grabbed for her, she ducked and spun, and then she slashed the carving knife into his leg, catching him behind the knee. She heard a yell of pain, and, as he buckled forward, clutching at his knee, Edie saw the bright blaze of the blind woman's heartstone in the chest pocket of his coat. Without thinking, she plunged her hand in, grabbed it, and ran, heading for the open ice. As she ran, she remembered that when she'd glinted the scene before, she'd seen the bonnet fall in front of her face as she tried to escape, and that as a result she'd run blindly into an ice hole where the walker had caught up with her. So as she ran, her first thought was to get rid of the bonnet. Her fingers fumbled at the ribbons, which was a bad mistake, because fumbling at full tilt turned out to be the very thing that made it fall in front of her face and blind her. You can't change the past, even if it hasn't happened yet. "How's this going to work?" said George. He was standing in a chariot being driven by a queen of the ancient Britons next to a World War I gunner cantering towards two small mirrors being held parallel to each other by the queen's daughters. The queen lowered her spear. "I touch the mirrors as we pass, and we will go through." As they approached, the mirrors seemed impossibly tiny, but the daughters didn't flinch as the whirring blades on the wheels whipped past centimetres from their knees, and the queen jabbed her spear. And missed. "There's no time for this," said George, and leapt clear of the chariot. He ran towards the queen's daughters, remembering how he'd seen the walker step into the mirrors and pull the gunner with him. He touched a mirror, felt the surface tension give, and then he was falling through layers of blackness. The fall ended abruptly with him face down on the ice with a mouthful of snow. He looked up and saw the black wall of a barge in front of him, frozen in the ice. He turned and saw, 100 metres away, the lantern-lit carnival of the Frost Fair, and a parade with a white elephant at the centre of it, wending through the tented street. He'd dropped the hammer as he landed, and he scrabbled in the snow for it. He just found it when there was a popping noise from behind him, and the gunner tumbled out of nowhere. He grinned at George. "She's going to take forever getting through." "We don't have forever," said George, getting to his feet. "The elephant's already here. And there's Edie." And then he was just tearing across the expanse of snow-covered ice towards her, yelling as he ran, trying to cut her off. "Edie! Over here!" Fumbling at a bonnet, she didn't seem to hear him. The gunner started running too. He saw the walker break out of the crowd at a fast hobble. He saw him turn and shout at something in the darkness on the other side of the river. "Get the girl! Icarus! Where's the bull? Get the girl!" The gunner saw what was going to happen. He stopped heading for Edie and ran towards the side of the river, where the Thames watermen had cut a wide channel between the shore and the ice, so they could charge people for crossing over on planks they'd erected. George yelled at Edie, who hadn't seen him yet. "Edie! Don't look at the elephant!" And then he hit an ice hummock and tripped. But not before Edie saw him. Just as she was about to shout back, the walker hit her from behind, and they fell to the ice. Edie kicked and hit and bit like a wildcat. She smashed the blind woman's blazing heartstone clenched in her fist into the walker's one good eye, and the searing light temporarily blinded him. She booted him in the chin, tumbled backwards onto her feet, and ran while he swiped at her through his stone-dazzled vision. And then he pulled the long burnished dagger from inside his coat and ran after her. Still struggling with the bonnet that had been mashed forward over her face in the fight, Edie's foot hit water instead of hard ice, and she plunged forward straight into the hole. And as she fought to the surface, a hand reached over and pushed her back under. And there were bubbles and splashing, and her lungs filled with black water. And the last thing she saw, as she sank into the inky darkness, was the walker's face, lit red by the distant lanterns, grinning down at her through the floating tangle of her own hair. And then Edie died. George hit the walker at full speed, every ounce of power and rage in his body powering him into the larger man like a runaway train. The impact cartwheeled the two of them back in a cloud of snow. George swung the heavy hammer at the walker's body. It slammed into something the walker was wearing under his sweatshirt, something thick that gave and cracked at the same time. The walker gasped as the air was pile-driven out of him, but his left hand clawed out and gripped George by the hair and ear. The two of them staggered to their feet, eye to eye. The walker got a breath and snarled at George, his one good eye blazing. "Are you sure you want to fight me, boy?" "Oh, yes," said George, "and I'm going to kill you." As he accepted the challenge, he felt a ripping pain in his arm, jagging towards his armpit, and he knew that the twisting channel of bronze on his forearm had ripped forward, heading for his heart. He knew this brutal tussle in the snow and ice was the next duel, the moment he would live or die by. George saw the flash of the knife as the walker pulled it back, and then slashed it up in a cruel, gutting, killing blow. George didn't flinch. His hand closed round the sharp blade and held it tight. The walker's eye widened in shock as the boy jerked his hand sharply and snapped the blade clean from the haft. And then he pulled his hand back and stabbed the blade down into the walker's heart. And the blade hit something hard and skittered sideways, but with all the cold rage George had put into the blow, it still buried itself in the walker's shoulder, so deep that George couldn't pull it out. He let go and took a microsecond to notice that his hand wasn't cut at all, despite the fact that he'd gripped the double-edged blade like a vice. The walker stared at the broken dagger buried in his shoulder, and then howled in fury. George had time to look down at the black hole in the ice. Edie was long gone. He picked up the blazing piece of sea glass she'd dropped in her struggle and dropped it into the water. If she was alone and dead in the inky blackness, somehow the least he could do was leave the light on. He turned back to the howling walker and gave him a straight punch that knocked him flat on his back. Only then did George step back in order to pick up his hammer. There was a thunder of hooves, and the walker's eyes flicked left. He sneered up at George through a bloody mouth. "Now you die, boy!" George turned his head, and he saw the bull thundering across the ice at him. "Maybe," said George. "But you die first." He raised the hammer. "I'll deal with your bull after that." "It's not the bull," smiled the walker, his eyes flicking upwards. And the Icarus hit George like an airborne pile-driver. The gunner plunged into the narrow channel of water between the ice and the riverbank like a depth charge. He'd seen Edie go under, and he'd seen that neither he nor George would get there in time to save her, so he did the only thing that remained, which was to go under the ice. Tons of bronze don't swim too well, so he hit the bed of the Thames and did his best to plough through the blackness towards the spot where he estimated the hole in the ice was. Unable to see anything, he surged forward by instinct alone, flailing around with his arms as he went, hoping that if he couldn't see Edie's body, he might at least touch it by chance. But as he stared blindly, he realized it was a forlorn hope. The girl was gone. And then an orange light dropped out of the ice roof overhead, and he looked up and caught a brief glimpse of George staring downwards, his face momentarily uplit by the falling heartstone before he jerked away from the hole. The gunner reached out and caught the stone on its chain and held it high, the orange light shining brightly. And that's when he saw the body, its foot caught in a broken cartwheel, half buried in the ooze, its hair lifelessly going with the flow. He freed her foot and grabbed her, surging towards the riverbank, looking down at her pale, dead face. As he pulled himself out of the water, he felt Edie's body flop against him. He was about to start pumping the water out of her when he heard the angry snorting that heralded the approaching bull. He scooped her up and ran. George saw the gunner emerge from the ice out of the corner of his eye as the Icarus flew him away from the walker. The Icarus screamed at George, and he looked into the blind curve of the creature's breastplate. Somewhere inside the intricate structure, a mouth was shrieking anger at him. The Icarus was a worse flyer than Spout. George was only about 6 meters off the ice, and he saw something pop into existence and gallop across the ice beneath him, heading for the gunner, the whirling blades on its chariot wheels twisting ice devils out of the snow as it thundered along. George still had the hammer in his hand. He smashed it into the hull. He hit it again and again. As he did so, the Icarus shrieked and lurched in the sky, and then there was a crack, and the breastwork gave way, and George was staring into the mad eyes of the Icarus itself. The Icarus was a man, cramped into the narrow, confining space of the basketwork hull. His arms and hands were folded in on themselves, and his mouth and lower face were bound with some kind of webbing, but not obscured so much that George couldn't see the hostile insanity snarling out of the face. "Put me down," said George. The eyes burned brighter. The head shook violently back and forth in an unmistakable no. "Then I'm sorry," he said, and whacked the hammer dead center on the straining forehead. The mad eyes rolled back, and the Icarus plummeted. George had time to see they were going to land in open water, just beyond the point where the ice began. The Icarus hit the river and kept going down. George kicked for the surface and gasped air, and then turned to see the jumbled edge of the ice approaching. He grabbed at it as he reached it, but the ice bobbled away beneath his fingers, and he was pulled under the water. On the surface of the ice, the gunner had seen the bull just in time. He grabbed Edie's body and leapt clear as the sharp horns thundered in. The bull tried to hook him, but its momentum made it overshoot, and it crashed into the snow piled on the riverbank. The gunner heard his name being called, and whirled to see the Queen approaching across the flat ice field, her horses straining against their harness. There was another figure on the chariot, and it took the gunner an instant to realize that it was the officer. As he sped towards the incoming chariot, cradling the dead body as he ran, he heard the drumming of hooves and knew the bull was running after him again. The chariot approached without slowing, and he saw the officer pointing urgently. Mind the wheels! And then the officer leaned wide over the spinning blades as they closed on the gunner at breathtaking speed. The gunner felt the bull's breath on his back and a light tug as it tried to hook him again, but he concentrated on the spinning blades whirling in towards his knees. He stuck his arm out, hurdled the blades as they swept in under him, and his open hand slapped onto the officer's reaching forearm and gripped it at the same time the officer grabbed his arm. And then the momentum swung him up and round as the officer anchored himself on the chariot rail, and he was on board. The bull had no time to slow its headlong pursuit, and the spinning blades opened it up like a giant can opener. It pitched forward, its horns digging into the ice, and then it lay still. The Queen looked back. He won't be killing any more women. As the gunner dropped Edie to the bucking floor of the chariot, the Queen was turning it. "Hold on," she shouted. As the Queen hit the mirrors with the tip of her spear, the officer leapt off the back of the chariot. There was a pop, and the chariot disappeared. The officer scrambled to his feet. "Stay there," he said to the girls, and ran away from the lights of the Frost Fair towards the dark end of the ice. "She's dead," said the gunner, as the Queen reined the horses in and brought the chariot to a sliding halt in front of the artillery memorial. The Queen dropped to her knees next to where he was pumping at Edie's chest with the heel of his hand. "Then why are you doing that?" she asked. "'Cause I don't know what else to bloody do," he said. She looked up at him and saw the big tears rolling out of his eyes as he bent forward again and thumped his fist into Edie's breastbone in frustration and grief. And Edie threw up a great lungful of river water and then convulsed in a terrible coughing spasm. The gunner felt her heart. It was beating, faintly. He stared at her in disbelief. Then he looked at the Queen. He'd never seen her smile before, but now her face shone back at him. And then she was unfastening her cloak. "We need to warm her up." The gunner ran over to the monument where he saw the officer's coat and hat sitting next to the wet bundle of heartstones he had brought from the underground tank. As he picked up the officer's coat, he noticed the bundle was steaming. "Hurry up," shouted the Queen. "We've got to get her into something warm. She's slipping away again." "Hold up," he said, as he threw the coat over his shoulder and untied the bundle. Light blazed at him, a warm glow, like the orange at the heart of a well-banked-up fire. The Queen looked up in surprise as the gunner dumped the heartstones next to her. "Heartstones?" He started placing the stones around Edie. "I think they feel her. I think it's the spark of all them troubled girls kindling one last time. I think it's them having a last laugh at the walker." The Queen watched him carefully place a stone over Edie's heart, and then she dug her hands into the blazing stone pile and helped him surround Edie with the warmth. Finally, she wrapped it in with her cloak and the officer's coat. Slowly the colour returned to Edie's face, and her eyes flickered open again. Her small hand lay in the gunner's big bronze palm. He closed his hand gently on it, and then her eyes focused on him, and as she recognized him, she gripped his hand fiercely. "It's all right," he said. "I've got you. You are too tough for the walker to kill, and you're too bloody tough for the river to kill and all. You're safe." Edie nodded. "Where's George?" The officer didn't find George at the ice edge. He found his hammer, caught in a branch, and when he pulled it, he found George's hand still attached to it through the thong. And then he pulled on the hand, and that's when he found George, and pulled him spluttering and shivering out of the river and onto the ice. "Where's Edie?" was the first thing he said. "I'm afraid she's dead, old man," said the officer. "They've already taken her through the mirrors. Can you run?" George looked terrible as he stood there trembling, teeth chattering, fist clenched on the hammer. "Yeah," he said, staring across the ice. In fact, he looked like murder, because he was staring at the hunched figure of the walker, who was bent over something on the ice, scratching marks all round himself in the snow. "Good," said the officer, taking his shoulder, "because the real trick's going to be to get to those girls over there, the ones with the mirrors, without him seeing us." George shook the officer's hand off his shoulder. "Nah," he said, hefting the hammer. "That's not the bloody trick at all." He began to walk determinedly towards the walker. The walker was oblivious, for when George had hit him in the chest, he'd been protected by the two wax discs surrounding the mirror, but they had failed to protect the mirror itself. George had broken the dark mirror in two. The reason the walker was so fired up was that he realized he had, in front of him, the solution to only having one black mirror. It had never occurred to him. Take the one mirror and split it. The marks he was scratching into the snow were a pentacle of protection. George had just broken into a trot, the officer on his heels, when there was a pop from behind him, and the chariot appeared. "Boy!" yelled the Queen. "Get over here!" George kept going towards the walker. "I'm going to finish him," he shouted. "No, George," she shouted. "The girl is alive!" George stopped dead in his tracks. She reined in next to him. "Jump on! She's badly shaken. She's going to be fine, and she's asking for you. Come, quickly!" The officer grabbed George and dumped him in the chariot and jumped on after him. But George and the Queen were both looking at the walker and the intensity of his activity in the snow. They both looked at each other. "Why not?" said the Queen. George grinned through his shivering teeth as she clicked her tongue and urged the horses forward into a gallop. The walker was so intent on lining up the two broken halves of his black mirror that he didn't look up until the first shot kicked ice in his face. What he saw were horses careering towards him at full gallop, with the Queen hefting her spear, the officer firing at him, and George leaning out of the side of the chariot with a hammer held ready above the whirling scimitars attached to the wheel. "Fools!" he screamed. He crouched down with his nose on the snow, making sure the two dark mirror surfaces were facing each other exactly. He knew he had set it upright, because there was a burst of heat and steam, as snow began to melt under each mirror edge. Without a microsecond to spare, he muttered something under his breath, and reached into the dark mirror. As the whirling blades tore through the space where he had just been, the mirror pulled him in, and out of the way. George looked down, and saw he'd disappeared, and that they were riding through the pentagram of protection, obliterating the boundaries he had scratched in the snow. Then, as the Queen wheeled the chariot in a fast U-turn, they saw something else. The black mirror halves melted their way straight down through the ice and disappeared. But before they had quite vanished, something escaped through the door that the walker had opened in them. And because that something was made of nothing, it needed substance if it was to survive in this world. And the first thing it encountered were the ice devils, kicked up by the spinning blades of the chariot. As the chariot hurtled back to the Queen's daughters and the safety of the mirrors that they were holding, George looked back. He saw the ice crystals in the air whirl into a body shape that suddenly grew and chased after them. "Faster!" he shouted. "Go faster!" The ice devil grew bigger as it gained on them, impossibly fast, and then the officer twitched the reins and the lead horse hit the mirror, and there was a pop, and for a beat they all fell through layers of black, and as they did so they all had the sense of something flying past them, something very cold and alien indeed, like a blast of otherworldly frost. The London Stone sat behind its protective grille, in its usual niche on the side of Cannon Street. Nobody felt the dark hum of power it throbbed through the city, connecting its streets and its buildings and the stone creatures that peopled its landscape. But something noticed the London Stone. It noticed it the moment it arrived, and went to it faster than thought. Suddenly the stone was covered with an intense white frost that was so cold that it cracked. It was only a small fissure, but it was enough. The chariot bumped onto the grass, and the Queen pulled the horses to a halt. She turned in time to make sure her daughters reappeared behind them. They nodded at her, and all three shared the same fierce grin. "Something followed us back," said George, jumping out of the chariot and racing towards Edie. She grinned at him and threw up a warning hand. "Mind the stones!" All the warning stones were spread out on the ground around them, and all were now dull, except for a small blue one clasped in Edie's hands, a small blue warning stone that had been made into an earring. George stepped carefully over to her, and not knowing what to do, punched her on the shoulder. She smiled up at him and punched him on the leg, and that seemed to be okay for both of them. In the distance he heard the strangely comforting resonance of Big Ben sounding the hour. "Nice earring," said George. "Yeah," she said. "It's my mum's." "What was it doing in there, with the rest of the stones?" said the gunner. "They said she went mad," said Edie. "That's why she got taken away." "I guess that she was a glint too," said George. "Yeah, only nobody told her." "Why have all the other stones faded?" said the Queen. "But it keeps blazing." "Those stones," said the gunner, "belong to the glints that the walker killed. Maybe it's still alight, because she's still alive." Edie couldn't speak. George looked at his forearm. The second flaw that he'd felt jagging up his arm when he'd accepted the walker's challenge had gone, as he knew it would. He caught the officer noticing it too, as he handed George a blanket. "One to go, boy. Good man." George looked at the last flaw, still circling his arm as if it was waiting for the night to reappear and finish the duel he'd begun. He decided to worry about that later. As George sat down next to Edie, the officer said, "Listen." They listened. There was only silence. And silence, in London, doesn't happen, even at night. "City's gone very still," said the officer, and the clock just struck 13. They all stood up slowly and looked around them. The city was still, unnaturally still. There was no breeze and no noise. George walked to the edge of the road. A police motorcycle was frozen, leaning into the curve. There was no rider. He looked up at the familiar red mass of a night bus. There were no passengers, no driver. Edie peered into an empty taxi. Where have all the people gone? And why has everything just stopped? "Whatever we brought back with us," said the officer, "I don't think it's good." They all moved a little closer to each other, too caught up in what was happening around them to notice what was happening above them. Which was a shame, because what was above was definitely noticing them. The stone gargoyle was perched on the giant stone howitzer on the top of the artillery memorial. The gunner saw it first. He stepped in front of Edie and George, fumbling for his pistol. "Look out! Here we go!" George's hand shot out, and he pulled the gunner's pistol down hard. "It's okay," said George. "Gah!" said the gargoyle. George grinned. "He's one of us." The gunner put his revolver away slowly, and they all stood there, looking at Spout through the heavily falling snow. "Blimey," said the gunner. "If he's one of us now, we're really in trouble."